She stepped off the train with a child gripping her hand and another growing inside her. And the man she had come to marry was already dead. No money, no shelter, no one waiting, only the dead man's younger brother, a stranger with unreadable eyes and a failing ranch. And instead of turning her away, he did what no one in town believed was possible. He offered her his name, his land, and a place where both children would always belong. Like this video, and comment the name of your city so I can see how far this story has traveled. And don't leave, because the hardest part hasn't even begun. The train pulled into Dry Creek just past 2 in the afternoon, late by 40 minutes because of a broken coupling somewhere outside of Laramie, and by the time it finally shuddered to a stop at the little wooden platform, the summer heat had already turned the air above the tracks into something you could almost see bending. Evelyn Mercer stepped off last. She had planned it that way. Waited until most of the other passengers had gone ahead, collecting their bags and their children and their sense of purpose, before she allowed herself to step down onto the platform. She told herself it was because she didn't want Noah to get jostled in the crowd. The boy was small for 4 years old, and strangers' elbows caught him at exactly the wrong height. But the truth, the one she kept behind her back teeth and didn't take out even to examine, was that she was afraid of what would happen the moment her feet touched the ground here. Because once she stepped off, there was no going back. Noah came down the steps behind her, both hands gripping her skirt, his worn leather shoes finding each step with careful, deliberate precision. He was a quiet child by nature, had been since the day she found him, and he watched the unfamiliar platform with the particular stillness of a boy who had learned early that new places required observation before trust. "We there?" he asked. "We're here," Evelyn said. She adjusted her carpet bag on her left arm and reached back with her right hand to find his, and they stood together at the edge of the platform while the last of the crowd thinned out around them. The town of Dry Creek spread itself out in front of her in a way that didn't inspire confidence. A main street of packed dirt, a handful of storefronts with sun-bleached signage, a saloon at the far end that seemed to be doing better business than anything else. The surrounding land was flat and pale and enormous, stretching out toward a mountain range in the distance that looked like something drawn by a child, all jagged edges and haze. She had known from the letters that it wouldn't be Denver. Thomas Hawthorne had been honest about that much. Thomas. She let herself think his name once, fully, and then put it away. She was looking for a sign with her name on it, or a face that matched the daguerreotype Thomas had sent her in March. Square jaw, pale eyes, a hat pushed back on his head like the photograph was an interruption he'd been tolerating. She scanned the remaining faces on the platform and found none that matched. What she found instead was a man leaning against the far post of the platform railing, arms crossed over his chest, watching her in a way that suggested he had been watching her for some time. He was younger than Thomas had been in the photograph, or younger looking, at any rate, with the same general shape to his jaw, but something different in the expression. Less settled, less sure of what he was doing there. He pushed off the post when she looked at him directly, and he came toward her with the slightly halting walk of a man who had rehearsed something and was now doubting the rehearsal. "Ma'am," he said. He took his hat off. Are you Miss Evelyn Mercer?" "I am," she said. He nodded once, sharply, like the confirmation of something he'd been hoping was wrong. "I'm Gideon Hawthorne, Thomas's brother." She heard the past tense immediately. Thomas's brother. Not, "I'm here on behalf of Thomas," or "Thomas sent me to collect you." The grammar of it landed in her chest before his next words did. Ma'am, there's no easy way to say this." He turned the hat in his hands. His knuckles were rough, she noticed. Working hands. "Thomas passed 6 weeks ago. It was his heart. He was out checking the north fence line and—" He stopped. "He didn't suffer." Evelyn heard the words. She registered them. She had spent 3 days on a train rehearsing all the ways this venture might go wrong, had cataloged every fear she carried across every long flat mile of Kansas and Colorado. And this particular disaster had not been among them. Thomas Hawthorne had been 34 years old. His letters had been full of plans. "I see," she said. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. "I'm sorry," Gideon said. "I wrote to you as soon as I could. I don't know if the letter—" "It didn't reach me," She had already left by then. She'd sold the last of what she owned in Cincinnati 2 weeks before the train. No. He looked pained. I figured as much when you weren't on the earlier train. He looked at Noah then, really looked at him for the first time, and something shifted in his expression, not unkind, but recalibrating. This is your boy? This is Noah, Evelyn said. Noah pressed himself slightly against her leg and said nothing. He was staring at Gideon's hat. How old? 4. Gideon nodded. His eyes moved to her midsection, and she watched him do the arithmetic that everyone did, and she braced herself for whatever came next. The flinch, the judgment, the careful construction of an exit. She had seen all the variations. She knew them well by now. What she had not expected was for him to simply say, "Have you eaten?" She blinked. "I'm sorry? Have you eaten? Today. It's past 2 o'clock, and that train's been running late, so have you eaten?" "We had something this morning," she said, which was true only in the technical sense. She had split a bread roll with Noah at the first stop and called it breakfast. "All right." He put his hat back on. "There's a place on the main street that's tolerable. I think we should talk. There's things that need to be said, and I'd rather say them where there's a table and some coffee than standing here in the heat." He picked up her carpet bag without asking, which ordinarily she would have objected to, and he looked down at Noah. "Can you walk, son, or do you want—" "He can walk," Noah said, with great dignity, from approximately belt level. Something crossed Gideon Hawthorne's face. Not quite a smile, but something adjacent to it. "All right then," he said. "Let's go." The restaurant, if it could be called that, being more accurately a room behind a general store with 4 tables and a woman named Clara Potts, who cooked out of sheer will and resentment of the alternative, served them coffee and a plate of beans and cornbread that Noah ate with the systematic focus of someone who understood that meals were not guaranteed. Evelyn drank the coffee and tried to think clearly. Gideon sat across from her and turned his hat on the table between his hands and said, "I want to be straight with you, Miss Mercer." "Mrs.?" she said automatically, and then caught herself. "Evelyn? Please?" He nodded. "Evelyn, I want to be straight with you about where things stand." "I'd appreciate that." He was quiet for a moment in a way that told her he was choosing his words and not just gathering them. "The ranch it's Thomas's ranch, legally, was. Now it's mine by the terms of the will, but it's not in the position Thomas may have described in his letters. Thomas was an optimist. There was something in the way he said it, not bitter, just exact. The drought's been bad this year. We lost 1/3 of the herd in the spring. The North Pasture's barely producing anything. The well needs work. It's not a prospering operation right now." "He didn't mention that," Evelyn said. "No, I don't suppose he would have." He picked up his coffee cup and set it back down without drinking. "Here's the other thing. The arrangement you had with Thomas, the marriage, that arrangement no longer exists," she said. "I understand that." "Right. Yes." He looked directly at her then, and she realized his eyes were gray, not pale blue like Thomas's in the photograph, and there was something uncomfortably honest in them. "So what I'm trying to figure out, and what I imagine you're trying to figure out, is what happens now." "What happens now is I need to find somewhere to stay tonight," Evelyn said, "and then I need to determine whether there's any work available in this town, or whether I should take whatever money I have left and get back on a train." "What money do you have left?" She told him the figure. It was not large. He was quiet for a moment. "Where would you go?" "I don't know yet." "You have family?" "No." He looked at Noah, who had cleaned his plate and was now examining the grain of the table with his finger. He looked at Evelyn. He looked out the window at the street, which was having a slow afternoon. "I have a proposition," he said, "and I want you to hear it out before you answer, because I know how it's going to sound." She folded her hands on the table. "I'm listening." "The ranch needs someone who can manage the household end of things. Cooking, the kitchen garden, the books. Thomas was not organized. I'm not much better. I can work the land, I know cattle, I know horses, but the inside of a house and the records they're not my strength." He paused. "And the truth is, a spread that size, a man running it alone, people start to wonder. Neighbors, buyers, It gets harder to do business when there's questions about whether a place is being properly kept. You're talking about a practical arrangement, she said. I'm talking about a marriage, he said. Legal, on paper. And well, more than that, I hope, but I won't pretend to promise things I can't know yet. He stopped. That came out wrong. No, Evelyn said slowly. I think I understood it. She looked at this man, this stranger with his rough hands, and his honest gray eyes, and his halting, rehearsed speech. And she thought about the train fare she didn't have, and the rooms she couldn't afford, and the child beside her who had been passed between difficult circumstances for 4 years and deserved better than a mother making desperate calculations in a dusty restaurant at the edge of nowhere. And she thought about the child she was carrying, the one she hadn't told him about. There's something I have to tell you, she said. He waited. I am 6 months along, she said. He was very still. The father is not available, she said, using the same careful words she always used. He will not be part of our lives. I have managed this on my own, and I intend to continue managing it. She kept her voice even. I understand completely if this changes your 6 months, he said. Yes. He looked at Noah again, then at her. Then he did the thing she had not expected, not the flinch, not the exit. He picked up his coffee cup and finally drank from it, and then he said, Is there anything else I should know? She almost laughed. It came out as a small exhaled sound instead. I think that covers the significant points. All right, he said. All right meaning the proposition stands. He set his cup down. If you're willing. She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the quality of his stillness when she told him, not shocked, not calculating, just absorbing, taking it in without flinching away from it. She had spent months reading men's characters in their letters, and she had not been good at it, and Thomas Hawthorne had proved that. But this man had told her the ranch was failing before she'd asked, had not pretended to offer more than he could promise, and had not used the word problem once when looking at Noah or at her. I'm willing, she said. He nodded. He reached across the table and they shook hands, which was not romantic and not elegant, and which felt, more than anything else, like the beginning of something real. They were married 2 days later at the county clerk's office, with a paper-thin justice of the peace who smelled of tobacco and seemed personally aggrieved by the interruption to his afternoon. Noah stood beside Evelyn and held her hand and watched the proceedings with the alert, unreadable attention he gave to most things. There were no flowers. There was no gathering afterward. They drove out to the Hawthorne Ranch in Gideon's wagon as the afternoon light went long and gold across the flat land, and Noah fell asleep against Evelyn's arm before they were halfway there, and neither she nor Gideon spoke much, because there didn't seem to be much to say that would improve on the quiet. The ranch was, as Gideon had promised, not in good condition. The house was a 2-room structure that Thomas had apparently intended to expand and hadn't gotten around to. The barn needed new planking on the south wall. The kitchen garden had been untended for weeks and showed it. The yard was scattered with the particular kind of disorder that accumulates when a person is managing too many things alone. A fence post near the gate had been repaired with wire and intention and not much else. Evelyn stood in the yard with her carpet bag and looked at all of it. I know it's not, Gideon started. It's fine, she said. I've seen worse. She had in fact seen worse. Show me where things are. He showed her. She catalogued it all with the methodical attention she had developed over years of making insufficient things sufficient. 2 rooms, a loft where he'd been sleeping, a cast-iron stove that looked reliable, a root cellar with a discouraging inventory, a water pump that needed coaxing, a small shelf of account books with Thomas's optimistic handwriting filling them in amounts that didn't quite add up. Noah explored the barn with the careful enthusiasm of a child who had never had outdoor space, appearing at intervals in doorways to report findings. There are 4 horses, there is a cat with no tail, the cat does not like me, but I think it will. Gideon watched him from the barn door. He's a good boy, he said, not asking, stating. He is, Evelyn said. How long have you... Since he was 8 months old. She didn't offer more than that, and Gideon didn't press. That evening she made a meal out of what was in the root cellar, which was not much. Beans again, dried, some hard cornmeal, a piece of salt pork that had seen better days. She stretched it into something that could be called a dinner without apology, and they ate at the table in the main room, the three of them, with the evening light coming through the single window, and Noah eating solemnly as always, and Gideon eating with the distracted efficiency of a man more accustomed to fuel than food. "This is good," Noah said at one point, which was high praise from him. "Thank you," Evelyn said. Gideon looked up from his plate. He seemed to register Noah's remark and what it cost the boy in terms of social risk, 4 years old volunteering an opinion at a stranger's table, and something in his expression, not soft exactly, but open, said he understood the value of it. "It is," Gideon said. "It's the best meal this table's seen in a long while." Noah considered this information. "Did you cook before?" "Badly," Gideon said. Noah nodded. "My mother is a good cook," he said, and went back to his plate. Evelyn kept her eyes on her own food and did not look at Gideon because her throat had done something inconvenient, and she needed a moment. The town of Dry Creek found out about the marriage within 48 hours, because it was not a large town and the county clerk's office shared a wall with the barber, and the barber was not a man who held information in high regard. The reactions were varied, but the dominant tone was something between bewilderment and disapproval. Gideon Hawthorne had been considered a reasonable prospect by several of the town's more calculating mothers on behalf of their daughters. Not wealthy, certainly, but landowning and steady. And the news that he had married a stranger off a train within 2 days of meeting her, a stranger who arrived with a small child and was visibly carrying another man's child, struck the community as either an act of great compassion or of spectacular stupidity, depending on who you asked. Helen Beatty, who ran the dry goods store and operated as the informal clearinghouse for Dry Creek's social currency, had opinions she did not keep to herself. She shared them with Mabel Crow, who shared them with her husband Frank, who repeated them to 3 men at the feed store. And within a week, the general consensus being circulated in Dry Creek was that Gideon Hawthorne had made a fool of himself, that the woman had clearly taken advantage of his grief over his brother, and that the arrangement would not last the year. Evelyn heard about this secondhand through Clara Potts at the restaurant, who told her with the bluntness of a woman who thought people ought to know what was being said about them. "I appreciate you telling me," Evelyn said. "Doesn't mean anything," Clara said. "This town's made of people with not enough to do and too much to say. Just wanted you to know what you're walking into." Evelyn walked into it anyway. She walked into it at the dry goods store 2 days later when she came into Price Flour and cornmeal and felt Helen Beatty's eyes on her with the quality of someone cataloging evidence. "Mrs. Hawthorne," Helen said, using the name with a slight pause that held a whole editorial inside it. "Mrs. Beatty," Evelyn said pleasantly. She purchased what she needed, said nothing that could be repeated without it reflecting badly on its repeater, and walked out in the full summer heat with her basket and Noah at her side, and did not give the woman the satisfaction of a hurried step. "Why does she look at us like that?" Noah asked, once they were back on the street. "Because she doesn't know us yet," Evelyn said. "Will she get better?" "Some people do," Evelyn said. "Some don't. You can't always tell which kind until later." Noah appeared to be chewing on this. "Gideon doesn't look at us like that." "No," Evelyn said. "He doesn't." Chong. The first weeks were an education in survival logistics. The ranch operated on a rhythm that had gone irregular without Thomas, and Evelyn spent the first days just observing it, where the inefficiencies were, what was being done out of habit versus necessity, what had been neglected so long it had become invisible. She had a head for systems, which was perhaps an odd quality in a woman who had arrived in a frontier town with $63 and a 4-year-old, but it was hers, and she used it. She started with the account books. Thomas's handwriting was hopeful and approximate, numbers rounded in ways that didn't serve anyone, debts recorded in a column labeled temporary as if renaming them would change their nature. She spent 2 evenings at the table with a lamp and a pencil, going through them carefully while Gideon sat across from her reading nothing, just sitting, occasionally asking a question she answered without looking up. "He owed Carlisle at the feed store," she said on the second night. "I know. Did you know it was this much?" A pause. "I knew it was significant." She showed him the figure. He looked at it for a moment. "All right," he said. "I think if we prioritize the north pasture fence this month, I read in Thomas's notes that the south herd tends to drift through that break. And if they're ranging that far, we're burning feed, moving them back. You read his operational notes? I read everything in this house, she said. He was quiet for a moment. He wrote pretty thorough notes, Thomas did. He did. The numbers didn't match the plans. He always had more plans than resources, Gideon said. There was that same quality in it. Not bitter, just exact. He was the dreaming kind. I'm more the practical kind, Evelyn said. Is that a polite way of saying something? It's just an observation. She looked up then because she wanted him to know she meant it plainly. We need both, the plans and the practicality. Between the books and the land, we might actually have both. He looked at her in a way she couldn't quite read. Not guarded. Something else. What? She said. Nothing, he said. Thomas wrote a lot about you, in his letters, about the things you wrote to him. She didn't know what to do with that. She turned back to the accounts. He thought you were something particular, Gideon said quietly. He didn't know me, she said. He knew the version of me that writes letters. Is it very different? She thought about it honestly. I'm less eloquent in person, she said, and more tired. Gideon made a sound that was almost a laugh. Almost. Good. Gideon and Noah arrived at each other sideways, the way cautious things do. It started with the horses. Noah had developed a consuming interest in the 4 horses in the barn, had named them all within the first week, which Gideon discovered when he heard the boy speaking earnestly to the largest one through the fence slat. He stood listening for a moment before he understood that the conversation was one-sided by necessity, but that Noah had assigned the horse a personality and a set of opinions and was responding to them on its behalf. His name is Clarence, Noah explained, when Gideon came around the corner and found him there. I've been calling him Buck, Gideon said. Noah appeared to find this unfortunate. He doesn't look like a buck. Gideon looked at the horse, who was a heavily built sorrel with a white blaze and an expression of permanent mild grievance. He doesn't look much like a Clarence either, he said. He has a dignified face, Noah said firmly. Gideon crouched down so he was closer to the boy's level, which Evelyn had noticed he did when speaking to Noah. Not always, but often enough that she thought it was deliberate. You want to learn how to give him a proper greeting? He said. So he knows you're not a threat? Noah turned to him with the focused attention he gave to information he considered valuable. Gideon showed him how to approach a horse low and slow, how to let it smell the back of your hand before you touched it, how to stand at an angle so you weren't confrontational. Clarence, Buck. The horse tolerated this with the air of an animal that had very low expectations of people and was moderately satisfied when they were met. Noah patted the horse's nose with extraordinary seriousness. He likes me, he announced. He tolerates you, Gideon said. With horses, that's the starting point. Noah considered this. Is that how it works with people too? Gideon looked at him. Sometimes, he said. Did you tolerate us at first? Noah asked. 4 years old, direct as an arrow. A pause. I thought you both seemed like people worth knowing, Gideon said. Noah appeared to accept this as a reasonable answer and went back to addressing the horse. There were hard days. Plenty of them. The heat that summer was the kind that made the air itself seem hostile. Gideon rode the property in it and came back coated in dust and short-tempered in the way of a man who is tired but won't say so. Evelyn's pregnancy made the physical work of the household, the hauling, the lifting, the hours at the stove, increasingly difficult in ways she managed by simply not mentioning it, which was its own kind of exhausting. They had their first real argument in late July. It was about money, which most arguments are, even when they start as something else. Evelyn had been keeping the accounts and had identified a purchasing pattern. Supplies being ordered from Carlisle at the feed store at prices that were above what the next county offered, a habit Thomas had apparently maintained out of convenience or loyalty or inattention. She raised it at dinner. We could save almost $30 over the quarter if we ordered the bulk grain from Hewitt's in Milford, she said. Carlisle's been supplying this ranch since before Thomas inherited it, Gideon said. I understand that, but $30 is, it's not about the $30. She set down her fork. Then what is it about? It's about the fact that Carlyle extended us credit when the drought started and didn't charge interest on it. His voice had an edge she hadn't heard before. That's not nothing out here, Evelyn. You don't walk away from that kind of... You don't treat people like ledger entries. She was quiet for a moment. He wasn't wrong. She knew he wasn't wrong. You're right, she said. He blinked. Apparently he'd been braced for argument. I am? About Carlyle. Loyalty has value, and I didn't account for it properly. She picked up her fork. I'll note it in the books differently. He was quiet for a moment. Just like that? You made a valid point, she said. Noah was watching this exchange with the attention of a small naturalist observing unfamiliar species. Most people argue longer, Gideon said. I find it wastes time, Evelyn said. He looked at her across the table in that way again, the one she couldn't quite categorize. Thomas really didn't know you, he said. No, she agreed. He didn't. Wab. By August, the gossip in Dry Creek had taken on new material. Dorothy Marsh, whose husband owned the neighboring property to the east, had paid a call that Evelyn could only describe as reconnaissance, a visit with cake as a pretext, and a series of questions as the actual purpose. She sat at Evelyn's kitchen table and ate her own cake and asked, with the careful casualness of someone who had rehearsed the inquiry, about Noah's father. He's not in the picture, Evelyn said pleasantly. And the child you're expecting, Dorothy said. The father, also not in the picture, Evelyn said, with the same pleasantness. And then she offered Dorothy more coffee in a way that suggested the subject was closed. Dorothy reported back to the town, and the town added this to its existing file on Evelyn Hawthorne, and the conclusion drawn in certain quarters was that she was a woman with a history, which in 1878 was not offered as a neutral observation. Gideon heard about it from Frank Crow at the feed store. Frank said what Frank said, something about Gideon deserving better, about how it wasn't too late to... And Gideon said, in a voice that didn't rise or sharpen, but that Frank apparently found effective, my wife is a hard-working woman with good sense and 2 children to care for. I'd be careful about what you imply next. He didn't tell Evelyn about it. She found out from Clara, as she found out about most things. She waited until after Noah was in bed that evening, and then she said, while they were both still at the table, You didn't have to do that. He looked up from the piece of leather he was mending. Do what? Defend me to Frank Crow. He was quiet for a moment. How do you know about that? Clara. He made a sound. That woman. She means well. Evelyn turned her coffee cup in her hands. I've been managing my own reputation for years. I know how to... I know you do, he said. That's not... I wasn't doing it because I thought you couldn't. He looked at the leather in his hands. It's just that what he said wasn't right, and I was the one standing there. She looked at him. There was something in the set of his jaw that was different from stubbornness, more like principle, which was a different animal. Thank you, she said. He nodded, went back to the leather. Did you eat enough today? He said, after a moment. I noticed you didn't finish. I'm fine, she said. The heat's been bad. You should... Gideon. What? I'm fine, she said more gently. But thank you for noticing. He looked at her. Something passed across his face. Complicated, not fully readable. All right, he said. They sat together in the lamplight for a while after that, him with his mending and her with the accounts, and the quiet between them was of a kind that had changed texture from the quiet of the early weeks. Less careful, less provisional. Not comfortable yet, but working toward it. September came in early with a cooler edge that offered, for the first time all summer, the suggestion that the heat might eventually relent. Gideon rode out to check the north fence line on a Tuesday morning and came back by midday with a report that was better than it had been. 3 breaks instead of 6, the herd staying mostly where it was supposed to. Evelyn was in the kitchen garden, which she had brought back from the neglected state she'd found it in through 2 months of consistent attention. It wasn't much. Beans, some late squash, a struggling row of beets, but it was producing, which was more than it had been. Noah was beside her, which was where he spent most of his mornings now. He had taken to the garden with the same focused intensity he brought to everything, and he had a particular section that Gideon had designated as his, your corner, do with it what you want, where he was attempting to grow something he'd seen in a catalog and could not entirely describe. I think they're coming up, he announced, crouching over a patch of disturbed earth. Let me see. Evelyn bent awkwardly. Everything was awkward now, with the baby making its size known, and looked at the small pale shoots emerging from the dirt. Those might be them. Or they might be weeds, Noah said with philosophical acceptance. We'll see in a week. He stood and brushed his hands on his trousers in an exact imitation of a gesture she'd seen Gideon make a dozen times, and she felt something move in her chest. Not sadness, not quite, but something adjacent to it and also adjacent to gratitude. Can I ask you something? Noah said. Of course. Is Gideon going to be my father? Like, properly? She straightened up and looked at him. He was watching her with the serious gray eyes that she had no idea where he got them from, and he looked, just then, very young and very old at the same time. He already treats you like you're his, she said carefully. I know. Noah looked at the garden. I was wondering if it was going to be official. Would you want it to be? He was quiet for long enough that she knew he was actually thinking about it rather than just gathering words. I think so, he said. He showed me how to fix a wheel yesterday, and how to read a sky for weather. He paused. He doesn't make me feel like extra. She crouched down again, slowly, to be at his level. You have never been extra, she said. Not to me, not for one single day. I know, Noah said, but you're my mother, you have to say that. She almost laughed. Gideon doesn't have to say anything, she said, and he shows up anyway, every single morning. She looked at him. I think that counts for something. Noah considered this. Okay, he said, and went back to his possibly weeds. 3 weeks later, the baby started coming, and 3 weeks later there was no doctor within reach, and the sky had turned the particular sick green-yellow that meant something was building, and by the time Evelyn understood what was happening, the wind had picked up to the kind of sustained howl that made riding out impossible. She did not panic. Panic, in her experience, was a luxury for people with more options. She told Gideon in the kitchen calmly what was occurring, and she watched his face go through several things very quickly before settling into a particular stillness she had come to recognize as his version of decision. All right, he said. I need you to keep Noah occupied and calm, she said, and I know, he said. Thomas helped with a birthing once on the ranch. He told me, I remember what he said, the basic... He stopped. I can do this, Evelyn. She looked at him for a long moment, this man she had married in front of a resentful justice of the peace 4 months ago, this stranger who had become something she didn't have a fully adequate word for. Okay, she said. Then let's do it. The storm came in fully an hour later, and the world outside the windows turned white and furious. And Noah sat in the corner of the main room with a lantern and a book he couldn't read yet but studied with great seriousness. And Gideon was there, doing exactly what needed to be done, calm and clumsy and determined and present in a way that mattered more than competence would have. At dawn, when the storm had eased and the light came gray and clean through the window, the baby arrived. A girl, small and furious and announcing herself to the world with considerable conviction. Gideon held her first, just for a moment, before he placed her in Evelyn's arms. He looked exhausted and undone, and something else that she couldn't name. She's all right, he said. His voice was unsteady. She's all right. I know, Evelyn said. I can hear her. Noah appeared in the doorway, very small and very serious. Is that the baby? That's the baby, Gideon said. Noah came in slowly, approached the bed with ceremony, and looked at the infant with the expression of someone confronting something larger than expected. She's loud, he said. She is, Evelyn agreed. Is she going to be like that a lot? Probably, Gideon said. Noah absorbed this. Okay. He reached out one finger and touched the baby's hand, which closed around it reflexively, and his face did something complicated and young. Hi, he said quietly. I'm Noah. I'm your brother. Outside, the storm was fully over, and the morning light was coming through the window, and Evelyn held her daughter and watched Gideon sit down on the chair beside the bed with the slow, careful movement of someone whose legs have just decided they're done. And she thought, Whatever this is, whatever we are, it is real. She closed her eyes. The baby breathed. Noah kept his finger exactly where it was. The girl's name was May. Evelyn chose it on the third day, when she had slept enough to think clearly, and the baby had settled into a pattern that could be described generously as rhythmic, loud, then quiet, then loud again, with no apparent logic governing the transitions. Gideon had asked carefully on the second day whether she'd thought about a name, and Evelyn had said she was still deciding, and he had nodded and not pressed, which she appreciated. May? Because it was simple, because it was hers to give. Gideon said it once, standing over the cradle he'd spent the better part of a day constructing out of salvaged planking. Not beautiful, but solid, which was more important. And then he said it again, as if testing how it fit. May Hawthorne, he said. Yes, Evelyn said. He didn't say anything else, but she watched his face do something quiet and deliberate, the way a man looks when he's making a decision that doesn't require witnesses, and she understood that the name had been accepted in more ways than one. Noah had opinions about the baby that he shared without prompting. She was louder than he expected. She was smaller than he expected. She smelled strange. Her hands were the most interesting part of her. He reported these observations to Gideon as they worked together in the barn on the fourth morning after her birth, Evelyn able to hear them from the open window while she nursed May in the chair by the stove. Does she stay small like that? Noah asked. She'll grow, Gideon said. The sound of a tool being set down. You were small once. I don't remember that. Nobody does. A pause. Were you small? Everyone starts small. Were you loud like her? My mother said I was worse, Gideon said. Noah appeared to find this satisfying. Good, he said. Then she's normal. Evelyn pressed her lips together and said nothing, because she didn't want to interrupt them. The days that followed May's birth were the most physically difficult of Evelyn's life, and she had a reasonably extensive catalog to compare them against. The birth itself had been hard, harder than she'd let Gideon see, because there was no utility in him knowing the full extent of it, and recovery on a working ranch in the middle of an autumn that was turning cold fast did not offer much in the way of rest. The household did not stop requiring management because she'd just delivered a child. The stove needed feeding. The accounts didn't keep themselves. The kitchen garden needed what was left of its yield brought in before the first frost. She did less than she wanted to and more than she should have, which was the only available compromise. Gideon watched this with an expression she had begun to be able to read. A careful, contained concern that he expressed not through words but through action. He took over the water hauling without discussion. He made a rough attempt at breakfast on the mornings when May had been particularly insistent through the night, leaving something edible on the stove before he went out. Eggs fried to a consistency that left room for improvement but were hot and present, which was what mattered. He fixed the draft in the main room window that Evelyn had been noting in her mental list of repairs for 2 months. He did not say, "You should rest more." He said, "I got the water and there's coffee and Noah's with me today. He'll be fine." She understood, eventually, that this was his language, not the eloquent letter-writing language Thomas had used. All those careful phrases constructed for effect. Gideon's language was the language of showing up, of noticing, of doing the thing without announcing he was doing it. It took her longer than it should have to recognize it as kindness, because kindness that doesn't announce itself is easy to overlook. One evening in late October, when May was 3 weeks old and had been sleeping for an unprecedented 2 consecutive hours, and Evelyn had used the time to go through the month's accounts, she found a discrepancy she couldn't account for. A payment to Carlisle at the feed store, correct amount, but the date was wrong. It had been made 4 days before she'd noted they had the funds for it. She brought it to Gideon at the table. He looked at it for a moment. "That's right," he said. "Where did the money come from? I don't have a corresponding—" "I sold the gray mare," he said. She stared at him. The gray mare, the one he'd told her, weeks ago, was the best cutting horse on the property, the one he'd talked about in the tone of voice people use for things they don't intend to part with. "Gideon, Carlisle was going to start charging interest after November," he said. "The debt was old enough. It made more sense to clear it. You could have told me." "I'm telling you now." "Before," she said. "We make decisions together. That's That's how we agreed to do this." He was quiet for a moment, looking at the table. "You had just had the baby," he said. "I didn't want to put another. I thought I could handle it." "You thought you could handle it without me knowing," she said. "I thought I could spare you something," he said, and his voice had an edge that wasn't quite defensiveness and wasn't quite anything else she could name. I know that's not how you want it, but it's where I was." She looked at him. He was looking at the account book rather than at her, and his jaw was set in the way it got when he'd done something he half regretted but couldn't fully bring himself to undo. "The mare was worth more than the debt," she said. "A little. How much more?" he told her. She did the arithmetic quickly. "That's $8, she said. "It's in the tin on the shelf," he said. It's in the household tin." She looked at him for a long moment. He had sold a horse he valued to clear a debt before it accrued interest, put the surplus in the household tin, and not said a word about it. She thought about what it cost a person to do something like that quietly, to not need the acknowledgement of it. "Next time," she said more gently, "tell me first. We can figure it out together." "All right," he said. "I mean it." "I know you do." He looked up then. "I'll try." It wasn't a promise exactly, and they both knew it, but it was the most she was going to get from a man who had been managing things alone for long enough that the habit was structural. She accepted it. "The mare was a good cutting horse," she said, after a moment. "The best I've had," he said, without self-pity. She went back to the accounts and didn't look up again, but she felt the shift in the room, the slight easing of something that had been held under tension, and she thought that this was what a real arrangement looked like. Not smooth, not elegant. Two people making adjustments in real time, getting it partly wrong, trying again. Winter arrived in earnest in November, which in that part of Wyoming meant business. The temperature dropped fast and stayed there, and the land turned from the pale gold of late autumn into the particular gray-white of a long season. Gideon spent the short daylight hours managing the herd through the cold, moving them, feeding them, checking for illness with the grim attention of a man who understood that losing cattle in winter was losing money he didn't have. He came in at dusk with cold worked into his hands and his face wind-scoured and red, and he ate whatever was on the table without complaint and was usually asleep before 9. Noah, who had been doing a reasonable impression of a small shadow attached to Gideon's heels since approximately the first week of October, was not permitted to follow him out during the worst of it, a restriction he accepted with vocal displeasure. "It's too cold," Evelyn said. "I have my coat," Noah said. "It's below 0, Noah." "I could wear 2 coats." "Go find something to do inside." Noah found something to do inside, which was to sit near the window and monitor Gideon's return from the pasture with the dedication of a small sentry. He reported updates. "He's at the south barn now. He's fixing the gate. He's coming back." When Gideon finally came in, stomping snow off his boots in the doorway, Noah was usually the first to appear, holding a cup of something hot that Evelyn had prepared and handed to him without instruction. Gideon always took it with both hands and said thank you, with a directness that suggested he meant it rather than performing it, and Noah always looked slightly too pleased with himself afterward. May, for her part, was growing in the aggressive, single-minded way of infants who have decided that existing is a project worth pursuing. She had opinions about most things and expressed them at volume. She had developed a preference for being held in a very specific position, left arm, slightly elevated, facing outward, and she communicated her dissatisfaction with all other configurations with impressive efficiency. Gideon held her in the evening sometimes, when Evelyn's arms needed a rest, and he did it with the careful uncertainty of a man who had not spent much time around infants but was applying himself. May regarded him with the considering, slightly suspicious attention she gave to everything, and then, sometime in late November, made a decision about him that expressed itself by falling asleep against his shoulder with total confidence. He sat very still after that, for longer than he needed to. "You can put her down," Evelyn said from across the room. "She settled," he said, and didn't move. She looked at him, this man holding her daughter in the lamplight, not moving so as not to disturb her, and she felt something shift in her chest that she had been carefully not examining. It was easier when he was difficult to read. It was easier when the arrangement felt provisional. She looked back at the mending in her lap and said nothing. The winter brought other things besides cold. Evelyn had been aware, since before they were married, that Gideon had a temper. Not violent, not the kind she had reason to fear, but a real one, with a shape to it. She had caught edges of it in passing, the day a section of the north fence failed for the third time, and he came back from fixing it in a silence that had weight. The evening she overheard him outside speaking to one of the horses with a flatness that wasn't directed at the animal. He kept it contained mostly, but it was there. In the second week of December it came out fully, and it was aimed at her. They had been having an argument that had started, as so many of theirs did, as a practical discussion. Evelyn had determined, through the accounts and through conversation with Clara Potts, that the ranch's grain storage would not last the winter at current consumption rates. She had a plan, a proposed arrangement with a rancher 2 properties over, a man named Aldous Reeve, who had surplus and was willing to sell. She brought it to Gideon at dinner. "I don't want to deal with Reeve," Gideon said. "Why not?" "He's not a man I trust." "He has grain at a fair price," Evelyn said. "His reputation in business is—" "I know his reputation in business." Gideon set down his fork. "It's the rest of him I have a problem with." "What rest of him?" "He treated his first wife like property," Gideon said flatly. "His second one left before the first year was out. Whatever he's like in business, that's the kind of man he is." Evelyn was quiet for a moment. "That's—" she chose her words carefully. "That doesn't directly affect a grain transaction." "It affects whether I want him on this property," Gideon said, "whether I want any arrangement with him that requires him to come here." "He doesn't need to come here. We could—" "Evelyn?" His voice had taken on a quality she hadn't heard from him before. "I said I don't want to deal with Reeve." "And I heard you," she said, keeping her voice even. "I'm asking you to explain the reasoning so we can make a decision that accounts for all of it, because the grain situation is real and it needs a solution. The reasoning is that I'm telling you no, and I'd like you to respect that." The room went very still. Noah, eating on the other side of the table, had gone absolutely motionless in the way children do when they sense something significant. Evelyn set down her own fork. She looked at Gideon steadily and she said, "I do not take orders in my own home." He looked at her. "If you have a reason I should know, tell me the reason," she said. "I can work with reasons. I've been working with reasons since before I arrived in this town. But I said no is not a reason I'm willing to accept as the end of a conversation." He was quiet for a long moment. She watched something move through him, the anger, and underneath it, something else. "His second wife," he said finally. "She came to Thomas 2 years ago. Asked if she could stay here one night before she left. Thomas let her." He was looking at the table. "She had a broken rib. She didn't say it was Reeve. She didn't have to." The silence that followed was different from the one before it. "I see," Evelyn said. "So no," he said. "I don't want him here. I don't want any transaction that requires—" He stopped. His jaw was tight. "I know that's not the practical answer." "It is, actually," she said. "For this household, it is." He looked at her. "I'll find another solution for the grain," she said. "We'll manage." She picked up her fork. "Thank you for telling me." He was still for a moment. Then he picked up his fork too. Across the table, Noah quietly resumed eating with the air of someone who had stored the whole exchange away for later consideration. After dinner, when Noah was in his corner of the loft, Gideon came to stand in the doorway of the main room where Evelyn was nursing May in the chair by the stove. "I shouldn't have spoken to you like that," he said. "No," she agreed. "You shouldn't have. When I think about that woman, He stopped. "I know," she said. She looked at him. It was still not all right. "I know that too." She looked at May, who had fallen asleep mid-nursing with the complete commitment of the very young. "You're allowed to have things you won't compromise on," she said. "I have them too. But the way you tell me matters." "I'll do better," he said. She looked at him across the room, this difficult, honest, imperfect man. "All right," she said. He nodded and went back to the other room, and that was as close as they came to an apology scene. No speeches, no drama. And she thought it was probably the more durable kind. She found alternative grain through a contact in the next county. It cost slightly more. She didn't mention the difference. Christmas came and went without ceremony. They had no money for it, which Evelyn would not have said directly, but which they both understood, and they made of it what they could. A meal that was better than usual, a wooden horse that Gideon carved for Noah over the course of 2 weeks of evenings when Noah was in bed, a length of cloth Evelyn had been saving that she made into something small for May. Noah received the wooden horse with the focused appreciation of a child who understands the value of things. He examined it from every angle. He ran his thumb along the carved mane. "You made this," he said to Gideon. Not a question. "Over the past couple weeks," Gideon said. "When?" "Evenings, when you were asleep." Noah looked at the horse again. Something was happening in his face that he was working hard to keep contained, in the manner of a child who has decided that visible emotion is a risk. "Thank you," he said. "You're welcome." A pause. Noah turned the horse in his hands. "Can he sleep in the loft with me?" "He's a wooden horse," Gideon said. "He can go anywhere you want him to." Noah nodded solemnly and carried the horse upstairs with both hands, as if it were breakable. Evelyn watched Gideon watch him go, and she saw in his face the thing he never said out loud, the particular quality of caring about a person that makes you feel exposed in a way you weren't expecting. "He loves it," she said quietly. "I know," Gideon said. His voice was slightly off, which on him was the equivalent of considerably off on most people. She touched his arm briefly as she passed, just once, just for a moment, and went to check on May. January was the hardest month. 2 cattle died in the second week, a small number in absolute terms, but not in terms of what they could afford to lose. Gideon found them on a Tuesday morning and came back to the house and told Evelyn with the flat economy of a man who has decided that brevity is the only protection he has against the full weight of a piece of news. "2," he said. She looked at him. "Which ones?" He told her. She did the arithmetic in her head, and it was not good arithmetic. "All right," she said. He sat down at the table and put his hands flat on it and looked at them. He was tired in a way that was beyond physical. The accumulated kind, months of it, the kind that doesn't resolve with sleep. She put coffee in front of him. She sat down across from him. "What do you need?" she said. He looked up. He seemed slightly surprised by the question, which told her something about the company he'd been keeping before she arrived. "I don't know," he said honestly. "Tell me about the North herd," she said. "The rest of them. What's their condition?" He told her. She asked questions. He answered them. Not because the conversation was going to fix anything, but because having someone to say the specific true things to made them slightly less crushing. She understood this from her own experience. The relief of being able to say, "Here is exactly how bad it is," to a person who would receive the information without flinching. She did not flinch. She asked about the pasture conditions, the remaining feed supply, the weather pattern Gideon expected for the next 3 weeks based on the way the last 3 had moved. She took notes on the back of an account sheet. "If we move the remaining south herd to the east pasture before the next front comes in," she said, "do you think the fencing holds?" "I reinforced it in November. So probably yes." "Probably," he said. "Then that's what we do." She put the pen down. "And we deal with the loss in the books, and we keep going." He looked at her for a moment. "You're very calm," he said. "I'm not calm," she said. "I'm just doing the next thing." He was quiet. "That's the same thing you said to me after May was born, when I asked how you were." She hadn't remembered he'd retained that. "It's usually the right approach," she said. "Doesn't it wear on you?" he said. "The constant not stopping." She thought about it honestly. "Yes," she said. "Sometimes I'm very tired." She looked at the table. "But stopping doesn't make it less." He nodded slowly. Outside, the wind had picked up and was working at the corners of the house in the way it did when a front was coming. "Gideon," she said. "Yeah, the ranch is going to be all right." She said it not to comfort him. She knew he didn't need comfort dressed up as information, but because she had been running the numbers and she believed it was true. "Not easily. Not this year, maybe not next year. But the land is good and you know how to work it. We're going to be all right." He looked at her across the table. "You believe that?" he said. "I'm not given to saying things I don't believe," she said. Something in his face settled. Not all the way. The weight was still there, but it shifted, redistributed itself. "No," he said, "you're not." February brought a visitor they hadn't invited, a man named Dale Pruitt, who identified himself as a land agent representing interests he did not name specifically, appeared at the ranch on a Thursday afternoon when Gideon was out with the herd and Evelyn was alone in the house with May and Noah. He was polite in the practiced way of someone who has been trained to be polite, with a suit that was too good for the conditions and a manner that was too smooth. He said he had heard the Hawthorne Ranch had been through some difficulties. He said he represented buyers who were interested in good land at reasonable prices. He said he could make Evelyn a very fair offer, and that if she and her husband were interested, he would be happy to come back when Mr. Hawthorne was present to discuss terms. Evelyn stood in the doorway and looked at him. "What interests do you represent?" she said. He named a company she didn't recognize. His manner remained pleasant. He offered a card. She took it. She looked at it. "Mr. Pruitt," she said, "I appreciate you coming out. You can direct any future correspondence to my husband through the county land office." She handed the card back. "Have a safe ride back to town." He looked briefly as though he wanted to say something else. She waited. "Of course," he said. "Good day, Mrs. Hawthorne." She watched him ride out down the road until he was a small figure, and then nothing, and then she went back inside and wrote down everything he'd said, in order, with as much detail as she could recall, and she kept the paper. When Gideon came in that evening and she told him, he was quiet in the particular way she had learned to read as alert rather than still. "Pruitt," he said. "You know him?" "I know of him," Gideon said. "He came through 2 years ago when the Kimball place went under. There were people who said the Kimballs had been pushed." "Pushed how?" "Grazing rights disputed, water access complicated. Nothing you could prove was deliberate." He looked at the table. "The buyers he represented got the land at less than half its value." Evelyn held that. "He'll come back," she said. "Probably. Then we need to know exactly where we stand, legally. Every document, every recorded claim." She looked at him. "Do you know an attorney in this county?" He thought for a moment. "There's a man named Prescott in Milford. Thomas used him once." "I want to write to him," she said. "I want everything reviewed, every title, every water right, every boundary claim." Gideon looked at her. "That costs money." "I know." "We're not—" "I know," she said. "We'll find the money. Because if there's something weak in our claim, I want to know about it before Pruitt does." He held her gaze for a moment, and she could see him measuring it, the cost against the risk, the known against the unknown. Then he said, "Write to Prescott." She wrote to Prescott the following morning. The response came 3 weeks later, and it was mixed. The land title was clean. Thomas had been careful about that, whatever his failings in accounting. The water access rights, however, were recorded in language that was ambiguous, a detail that might matter enormously or not at all, depending on how someone chose to interpret it and whether they had the legal resources to press the interpretation. Prescott's letter was 8 pages of careful legal language that Evelyn read twice and then summarized for Gideon in plain terms. "The water rights are a potential vulnerability," she said. "They're not immediately contested, but if someone wanted to challenge them, they could create a problem." "How big a problem?" "Without the creek access, we lose the east pasture. And without the east pasture, we can't maintain the herd through winter," he said. "No." He was quiet. He had the expression she associated with the moments when he was looking at a difficult thing without looking away from it, which she had come to consider one of his better qualities. "Prescott says we can file an amendment to clarify the language," she said. "It would establish the rights definitively. It's not cheap, but it would close the vulnerability." "How much?" She told him. He went very still for a moment. "I know," she said. "The spring cattle sale," he said slowly. If we get good prices, yes, we'd have enough." She paused. "It's a risk. We'd be betting the spring sale against the legal cost. But if we don't file and Pruitt moves, then we're in a worse position with fewer options," she said. He stood up and walked to the window and stood there looking out at the land. His land, Thomas's land, the land that had been in the family for 15 years now. And she let him stand there as long as he needed to. "File," he said. "All right." He turned from the window. He looked at her. "Evelyn." "Yes. I'm glad you were here when Pruitt came," he said. "When he came and I wasn't. He paused. I don't know what I would have done about the letter, about Prescott. I don't know that I would have thought to. You would have figured it out, she said. Maybe. Later. He looked at her steadily. I mean that you caught it early. That matters. She understood he was not good at this part, the part where acknowledgement was given. It cost him something to say it directly, which meant it was worth more than it would have been from someone for whom it came easily. We caught it, she said. He looked like he might argue, and then he didn't. Yeah, he said. We did. It. Spring came eventually, the way it always does after a hard winter. Not all at once, but in arguments, cold days followed by warm ones followed by cold again, until the warm side started winning. The winter had changed things in ways that were difficult to inventory. The ranch was still standing, still operating, still, by the thinnest of margins, viable. But something else had also happened across those months, in the space between the arguments and the late evenings at the table and the small daily negotiations of two people learning each other's language. Something had changed between Evelyn and Gideon that she had been carefully not naming, because naming things made them real, and real things could be lost. She noticed it in small ways. The way she had stopped thinking of the house as his house with her in it. The way certain silences with him had become something she recognized as rest rather than distance. The way she had, somewhere in February without marking the moment, stopped calculating exits. Noah noticed things too, which she should have anticipated, because Noah always did. On a warm Saturday in March, when Gideon was in the south pasture, and Evelyn was working in the garden, and May was in her basket in the yard making commentary on the clouds, Noah appeared beside her with a stick he was using as a tool, with no defined purpose. Can I ask you something? He said. Of course, she said. Are you and Gideon, are you properly married now? Like really? She sat back on her heels and looked at him. We were legally married in October, she said carefully. I know that. I mean, are you really? Like, not just for the ranch. She was quiet for a moment, looking at her son, this boy who had come to her under circumstances she never talked about, and who had grown into a small, serious, perceptive person who apparently noticed everything. I think that's between me and Gideon, she said. He considered this. He looks at you different than he looks at other people, he said. Does he? Yeah. Noah prodded the dirt with his stick. Like you're important, like the way he checks the herd at night when it's cold. She looked at him for a long moment. Where do you get these things? She said. I watch, he said. Like it was obvious. She went back to the garden. We're all right, Noah, she said. Gideon and we're all right. He seemed to accept this. He stayed beside her for a while, poking at the dirt with his stick, and May made small sounds in her basket, and the afternoon light came across the yard in the particular way it did in early spring, thin and careful and promising more than it was quite ready to deliver. Good, Noah said eventually, and that was the end of it. But that evening, when Gideon came in from the pasture and washed up at the pump in the yard and came through the door, Evelyn looked at him in a way she hadn't quite permitted herself before, direct and without the usual layer of measurement, and he stopped for a moment when he noticed. What? He said. Nothing, she said. Dinner's ready. He looked at her for a moment longer than necessary, and then he came to the table, and Noah was already sitting there with May in his lap, holding her with the careful competence of a child who has been practicing this. And Gideon sat down and they ate together, all four of them, in the kind of ordinary, imperfect, fully inhabited way that Evelyn had not quite believed was available to her anymore. She didn't name the thing in her chest. She didn't need to yet. But she stopped, for the first time in a long time, calculating against it. Outside, the land was still cold, but the cold had a different quality to it now, a retreating kind. The kind that knows its season is ending. And the Hawthorne Ranch sat in the middle of it, not prospering, not easy, not anything that could be called settled, but standing, which was more than it had been, and more than enough, for now, to build on. The spring cattle sale saved them, but only barely. Gideon drove the herd to Milford in the second week of April, with two of Carlisle's hired hands helping, which Carlisle had offered without being asked and without framing it as a favor, which was exactly the kind of man Carlisle was, and exactly why Gideon had sold a horse he loved to clear the debt rather than let it sit one more season. The drive took 3 days. Evelyn stayed at the ranch with Noah and May and managed the absence the way she managed most things, by staying occupied enough that the waiting didn't have room to expand. Noah was 7 now, and the waiting bothered him more than it bothered her. He checked the road south every morning with a seriousness that would have been funny if it hadn't also been entirely sincere. "He'll be back by Thursday," Evelyn told him. "What if the prices are bad?" "Then he'll deal with it and come home anyway," she said. "The prices don't change when he gets here." Noah accepted this logic but continued checking the road. Gideon came back on Wednesday evening, 2 hours before dark, covered in trail dust and looking like a man who had slept poorly on cold ground for 3 nights, which he had. He came through the gate, and Noah was there before the horse had fully stopped, asking about the herd, about the prices, about whether he'd eaten. Gideon looked down at him from the saddle. "The prices were good," he said. Noah exhaled. "How good?" "Good enough." He swung down and handed off the reins and looked at Evelyn, who was standing at the edge of the yard with May on her hip. Something in his face told her the number before he said it, and she did the arithmetic against what they owed Prescott and what remained of the winter debt and what the east pasture fence would need before summer, and the number worked. Not generously, but it worked. "Good enough," she said. "Good enough," he agreed. He was too tired for more than that, and she didn't require it. She fed him and let him sleep, and in the morning they sat at the table with the account books and the letter from Prescott, and they divided the money with the careful, unglamorous attention of people who have learned that the numbers are the ground everything else stands on. The Water Rights Amendment was filed with the county land office the following week. Prescott sent confirmation in May. The vulnerability was closed, at least on paper, which was not the same as closed in fact. Evelyn understood that. But it was the best available position, and she had learned to work from the best available position rather than the ideal one. Dale Pruitt did not reappear that spring. He would eventually, she suspected. Men like Pruitt had patience because they had options, and they came back when circumstances shifted. But for now, the Hawthorne Ranch had its water rights recorded clearly and its land title clean and its herd replenished, and that would have to be enough. What it did not have, and what the spring sale had not fixed, was a good well. The pump Evelyn had been coaxing since October finally refused to be coaxed any further in June. Gideon pulled it apart and looked at it with the expression of a man receiving information he'd been expecting and resenting the confirmation of. The well itself wasn't dry. There was water down there, but the mechanism was beyond repair, and the materials to replace it were not cheap. "How much?" Evelyn said. He told her. She looked at the account book. "We have about half of that," she said. "Yeah. Who in this county knows wells?" He thought. "There's a man named Hector Voss, does well work in the northeast part of the territory. He's good. He's also slow and particular, and he'll tell you 12 times how he'd have done it differently if he'd been involved from the start. Can he fix it? If he takes the job, yes." "Write to him," she said. "We don't have—" "Write to him. We'll find the rest." She closed the account book. "I've been thinking about the kitchen garden. If we expand the south plot and put in a proper cash crop this season, beans, maybe squash. Claire said the restaurant in Milford has been buying from the tanner place east of here, but the tanners are inconsistent. If we could establish a regular supply—" Gideon was looking at her with an expression she'd seen before. The one she associated with him recalibrating something. "What?" she said. "You've been working on this already," he said, "before the pump broke." "I've been thinking about it since March," she said. "The ranch income is too dependent on the cattle. One bad season and we have nothing to fall back on. We need another revenue line. A kitchen garden isn't— not just a kitchen garden, a proper market garden. 20, 25 rows. We'd need to hire someone part-time for the harvest months, but the margin— You've run the numbers." "I've run the numbers," she confirmed. He leaned back in his chair and looked at her and said nothing for a moment, and she could see him doing what he sometimes did, locating his own opinion against hers, not to contradict but to understand where the difference was. "The water," he said. "A market garden that size needs more water than we're currently moving, which is why we need the well fixed properly rather than patched," she said. "Not just the pump mechanism. Voss should look at the whole thing. If we're going to do this right, we're going to need more capital than we have." "Yes." He was quiet. Carlisle? I'd rather not go back to Carlisle until we've cleared more of what we owe. Then who? She had been thinking about this too. There's the Territorial Agricultural Fund, she said. It's a lending program through the territory government for homestead improvements. Prescott mentioned it in his second letter, in the margin. I don't think he thought I'd follow up on it. Did you? She reached into the account box and produced a letter she'd received 10 days ago and not yet shown him. She watched his face while he read it. They'd lend against the land, he said. At fixed interest, yes, lower than the bank. And if we can't pay, we can pay, she said. Look at the repayment schedule I put together. She passed him another sheet. If the market garden produces what I project and the cattle sale next spring is comparable to this year, we're current by the end of the second year. He studied the sheet for a long time. She let him. She had learned that his silence while he was reading something was not resistance. It was engagement, and it was worth respecting. This projection, he said finally, the garden yield, this is optimistic. It's based on the Tanner Place's numbers from Clara, she said, and our soil is better than the Tanners. It's not optimistic, it's conservative. He looked at her. You talk to Clara about this. Clara knows everything that moves through 3 counties. She's a better source than any almanac. He looked back at the sheet. He was fighting something. Not the idea, she thought, but the size of it. The commitment. Gideon operated close to the ground, always, in amounts he could see and touch. This required looking further than he was comfortable looking. It's a lot of risk, he said. Everything we've done since October has been a lot of risk, she said. We fixed the water rights, and the ranch is still standing. We paid Carlisle, and we're still standing. The risk we don't take is the one that keeps us small enough that the next bad winter finishes us. He was quiet for a long moment. Outside, Noah was in the yard doing something with a piece of rope in the fence post, practicing a knot Gideon had showed him the week before. All right, Gideon said. She applied to the Territorial Agricultural Fund that afternoon. The approval came in August. That summer, the town of Dry Creek adjusted its opinion of the Hawthorne Ranch with the reluctant, incremental quality of people who had committed to a position and were now being inconvenienced by evidence. It wasn't a dramatic shift. Nothing in Dry Creek ever shifted dramatically if it could help it. But there were observable changes. Carlisle, who had always been decent, became warmer. Frank Crow, who had been among the louder voices predicting the marriage's collapse, began saying hello first when he passed Gideon on the street. Helen Beatty at the dry goods store still had opinions, but she expressed them more quietly, and she no longer gave Evelyn the pointed pause before Mrs. Hawthorne. Clara Potts, who had been Evelyn's most reliable source of both information and plain speaking since she arrived, told her in July, "People are coming around." "I hadn't noticed," Evelyn said. Clara gave her a look. "Yes, you had." She had, of course. She noticed most things, but she had learned early that acknowledging what the town thought of her was a way of giving it more power than it deserved, and she had no intention of doing that. What she hadn't anticipated was Dorothy Marsh. Dorothy, whose husband's property bordered the Hawthorne Ranch to the east, had been among the more efficient distributors of Dry Creek's opinions about Evelyn's history. She had visited once with cake and questions and had not been invited back. She and Evelyn had existed since then in a state of cordial mutual avoidance that suited them both. In July, Owen Marsh broke his leg. It was a ranch accident, a horse spooked, a fall, the particular bad luck of an angle. And the break was serious enough that the Marsh Ranch was left with Dorothy and 2 young sons who were old enough to help, but not old enough to manage the property through what promised to be a difficult summer. Evelyn heard about it from Clara on a Tuesday. By Thursday, she had organized a rotation of help from 3 neighboring ranches, including her own, that would cover the Marsh property's most critical needs through the worst of Owen's recovery. She did this without telling Gideon first, which he noted when he came in from the east pasture to find her writing out the schedule. "The Marsh place?" he said. "Owen broke his leg," she said without looking up. "I heard." He came to stand behind her and looked over her shoulder at the paper. "Is Dorothy... Did she ask for..." "She didn't ask," Evelyn said. "She won't ask. She's too proud and she's worried about what it means to need help from people she's spent a year and a half saying things about." She kept writing. "That's not a good enough reason for her children to go without what they need this summer." He was quiet for a moment. You're organizing this despite the fact that she's been... Yes, right. He straightened up. What day am I going over there? She told him. He went without further commentary. Dorothy Marsh came to the Hawthorne Ranch 2 weeks later, on a Saturday morning when she knew Gideon would be out, and she sat at Evelyn's kitchen table and she did not bring cake this time. I owe you an apology, she said. No preamble. Evelyn poured coffee and said nothing. Some of the things I said, the things I repeated, about you and your situation. Dorothy kept her eyes on the table. She was not comfortable with this, which Evelyn respected. Comfortable apologies cost nothing. They weren't right. I didn't know you and I said them anyway. You did, Evelyn said. Dorothy looked up. She seemed slightly surprised that Evelyn wasn't making it easier for her, and Evelyn had no intention of making it easier for her, because the comfortable version of this conversation didn't serve either of them. I'm sorry, Dorothy said. Evelyn looked at her. Dorothy Marsh was not a bad woman. She understood that. She was a woman who had made the social calculations that the town offered, had followed the established pattern of judgment, and had been wrong in the specific way that most people are wrong, not from cruelty, but from incuriosity. I appreciate you saying that, Evelyn said. Directly. Dorothy nodded. She seemed to be waiting for something, absolution possibly, or dismissal. How is Owen doing? Evelyn said. Something in Dorothy's face relaxed slightly. Better? The bone is setting right, the doctor thinks. Good. Evelyn sat down across from her. The rotation through next month should keep your south pasture managed. After that, if Owen can't ride yet, we'll figure out what's needed. Dorothy looked at her for a moment. Why? She said, genuinely asking. Because it's the right thing, Evelyn said. And because I have a daughter who is going to grow up in this valley, and I'd like it to be a place where people help each other when things go wrong. She picked up her coffee cup. Even when it's inconvenient. Dorothy was quiet for a moment. You're a strange woman, Evelyn Hawthorne, she said, but the way she said it had changed from the last time she'd been in this kitchen. I've been told that, Evelyn said. The Market Garden's first season was not the success Evelyn had projected, and she had been honest enough in her projections that this meant it was a genuine shortfall rather than an inflated expectation meeting reality. A late frost in May took 2 of the prepared rows before they'd established. A pest problem in July required treatment that cost money she hadn't planned for. The yield at harvest was about 70% of what she'd anticipated. She sat with the numbers in September and looked at them for a long time. Gideon found her there and sat down across from her and said nothing, waiting. We're short, she said, not critically, but short of what I projected. How short? She told him. So the loan repayment is still manageable, she said, if the cattle sale in the spring is comparable to this year, but the margin is thinner than I wanted. He was quiet for a moment. She was looking at the numbers, not at him, but she felt the quality of his quiet, not judgment, just presence. What happened? He said. She told him about the frost, the pest problem, the 2 rows she'd miscalculated on drainage. She was honest about each one, which ones were bad luck, and which ones were errors she could have avoided with better planning. The drainage on the south end, she said. I should have caught that before planting. I knew that ground was lower. I was moving fast and I didn't account for it properly. And next year? Next year I'll plant that section differently, and I'll have the beds prepared earlier so the frost doesn't catch them green. She finally looked up. The 70% we got, we sold. Clara took everything we could bring her. The model works. The first year of anything is harder than the plan says it should be. He held her gaze. Are you all right? He said. She was slightly surprised by the question. Not its content, but its directness. Gideon had gotten better at the direct version over the course of the year, and it still occasionally caught her off guard. I'm frustrated, she said. I don't like being wrong. Most people aren't that honest about it. Most people don't keep account books, she said, which wasn't entirely the point, but was the easier version of it. What I mean is, he paused, choosing. You built something this year that wasn't here before. It didn't work perfectly. That's not the same as it not working. She looked at him. He meant it plainly, which was the only way he ever meant anything, and she felt the particular quality of being seen by someone who is not trying to make you feel better, who is just saying the true thing. Thank you, she said. He nodded. What do you need for next year to do the south end properly? She told him. They worked through it together at the table, and by the time Noah came in from the barn with his boots muddy and May toddling after him in the determined, slightly unstable way she'd been moving since August, they had the next season's garden plan roughed out in the margin of the account book, and the numbers, while not generous, were survivable. But the trouble with Pruitt came back in October. Not Pruitt himself this time, but the company he represented, the name on the card she had handed back to him the previous winter, which turned out to be a land acquisition concern with territorial connections to a man named Harlan Cross, who Gideon knew by reputation and whose reputation was not good. The first sign was a boundary dispute. A survey marker on the northeast corner of the Hawthorne property was found moved, not by much, not dramatically, just enough to shift the recorded line by 40 feet in a direction that would, if the shifted survey were accepted, cut off a section of the creek access that fed the east pasture. Gideon found it on a Wednesday morning and came back to the house and told Evelyn in the flat exact way he reported things he was angry about. Moved, she said. 40 feet northeast, he said. When? Recent. The ground around it's been disturbed. She was quiet for a moment, looking at the map she'd had Prescott send her when they'd filed the water rights amendment, a detailed plat of the property with all recorded boundaries. She laid it on the table and looked at the northeast corner. That survey marker has been there since the original homestead claim, she said. Since Thomas's father, Gideon confirmed. And if someone challenged the current position as the legitimate one, our water access to the east pasture is compromised, he said. The creek runs through that 40 feet. She looked at the map for another moment. Then she folded it carefully and put it in the account box with the letter from Prescott and the copy of the water rights amendment and the notes she'd made when Pruitt visited in February. I want to ride out to that marker, she said. It's 3 miles. I know how far it is. He looked at her. May. Dorothy Marsh will take May for the afternoon. She's offered twice. She was already getting her coat. I want to see it for myself. They rode out together, Noah staying behind to watch the garden, and Evelyn looked at the marker and the disturbed ground around it, and the creek line that ran through the contested 40 feet, and she was very quiet for the whole ride back. That evening she wrote 3 letters. One to Prescott, with a description of what they'd found and a request for advice on legal remedies. One to the county land office, formally noting the apparent discrepancy and requesting that the original survey records be located and preserved. And one, which she did not show Gideon until she had finished it, to the Territorial Land Commissioner's office in Cheyenne. Cheyenne, Gideon said, reading it. The county handles routine claims, she said. But if this is part of a pattern, if Cross or whoever is behind this has moved markers on other properties in this territory, the commissioner's office is the right level. You think it's a pattern? I think a man who had his agent approach us and who the Kimball's situation points to doesn't move one marker on one property by accident, she said. I think he identifies weaknesses and applies pressure systematically, which means there are other properties. Gideon was quiet. If there are other ranchers in this county who've had similar issues, they need to know, she said. And if they know, and they're willing to speak together rather than separately, you want to organize something, he said. I want to find out if there's something to organize, she said. There's a difference. He looked at her in the way she'd come to understand as him measuring something, not doubt exactly, but the weight of a thing, its dimensions. You've been thinking about this for a while, he said. Since February, she said. When Pruitt came. He put the letter down on the table. Evelyn, he said. Yes, if you do this, if you start making noise at the commissioner's level, contacting other ranchers, Cross isn't going to just send Pruitt back. His voice was level, but it had something underneath it. Men like Cross push back. I know, she said. That's not me saying don't, he said. I want you to understand what we're saying yes to. She looked at him directly. I understand exactly what we're saying yes to, she said. I've been calculating it since the marker showed up. She paused. The alternative is we wait, and the next thing they move is something we can't recover from. He held her gaze for a long moment. All right, he said. Then we say yes. She mailed all 3 letters the following morning. But Prescott's response came first, and it was useful. The original survey records existed. He had located them in the county archive, and they definitively established the marker's correct position. He could file a formal challenge to the altered survey, restore the recorded boundary, and do it in a manner that created a clear paper trail of who had raised the challenge and on what grounds. "Do it," Gideon said when she read him the relevant section. She wrote back to Prescott that afternoon. The response from the Territorial Commissioner's office came 2 weeks later and was more cautious, the language of an office that dealt with political considerations as much as legal ones, but it confirmed that a records inquiry had been opened and that any documentation she could provide regarding the boundary dispute would be entered into the file. The third thing that happened, which she had not anticipated, was Frank Crow. Frank Crow, who had once told Gideon he deserved better than the woman he'd married, appeared at the Hawthorne Ranch on a Thursday in late October with his hat in his hands and a look on his face that Evelyn associated with men who have swallowed something they've been avoiding. "I'd like to speak with both of you," he said. They sat at the table, all three of them, and Frank Crow told them that a surveyor he didn't recognize had appeared on his property's east boundary 3 weeks ago, and that 2 of his fence posts had been found uprooted in a section that bordered a piece of land he'd recently been approached to sell. "Who approached you?" Evelyn said. He described the meeting. The company name he mentioned was different from the one on Pruitt's card, but Prescott had written her a note suggesting Cross operated under several business names, and the description of the approach, the knowledge of Frank's financial difficulties, the framing of the offer as a favor rather than an acquisition, the implicit suggestion that resisting would create complications, matched closely enough. "You didn't sell," Evelyn said. "No," Frank said. "I told them I needed time to think." He looked at his hat. "I've been thinking." Gideon said nothing. He was leaving this to her, which she appreciated. "We've filed with the county and with the commissioner's office," Evelyn said. "If you've had a similar experience, you should do the same, documented and formal." "Does it help?" Frank said. "Actually, it creates a record," she said. "One complaint can be dismissed. Multiple complaints, from multiple properties, showing the same pattern, becomes harder to dismiss." She looked at him. "Do you know of anyone else in this valley who's been approached?" Frank named 2 names. One she recognized, one she didn't. "Would they talk to me?" she said. He looked at her. This woman who he had told his friend didn't deserve better than to be left, and who was now the clearest-headed person in any room she entered, a fact Frank Crow had apparently arrived at on his own. "I think so," he said. "If you asked." She wrote to both names that week. By November, there were 4 ranches that had documented boundary irregularities or unsolicited acquisition approaches in the same 2-year window. Evelyn organized the documentation, copied, dated, cross-referenced, and sent a consolidated file to the commissioner's office through Prescott's office address to ensure it was received and logged correctly. She did not know if it would be enough. She knew enough about how these things worked to understand that a land acquisition concerned with territorial connections and sufficient capital could outlast a group of homesteaders in any protracted legal fight. What the documentation gave them was not certainty, but position, a defensible place to stand while they figured out the next step. Gideon understood this. He said so on the evening she sent the consolidated file. "This isn't over," he said. "No," she agreed. "But we're not alone in it anymore." "That's the point," she said. He looked at her across the table. May asleep in her cradle, Noah upstairs in the loft with his wooden horse and his stash of things he considered valuable, the lamp making the room amber and warm against the cold outside. And he said, "You know, when you got off that train, I thought I was managing a hard situation, doing the decent thing." She waited. "I didn't know," he said. He wasn't looking for a response, she could tell. He was just putting words to something he'd been carrying. "That you were what you are." "What am I?" she said, genuinely asking. He looked at her directly. "Someone who knows how to fight," he said, "and who picks the right fights." She held his gaze. "You fight too," she said. "You just do it by showing up every morning to a ranch that was failing and not stopping." He shook his head slightly, as if that didn't quite deserve the same category. "It does," she said, reading him. "What you did for Noah, for May, for me. That first day, when you didn't have to." That's a kind of fight, too. A long one. He was very still. You didn't manage a hard situation, she said. You made a choice, and you've made it every day since. She looked at him steadily. That's not nothing, Gideon. That's not anywhere close to nothing. Outside, the wind moved through the yard in the way it did in November. Purposeful, full of winter intention. Inside, the lamp held steady, and the room held them, and Evelyn Hawthorne looked at the man across the table from her and stopped, finally and completely, looking at him as the thing she'd ended up with. He was what she'd chosen. Both of them had chosen, one day at a time, across a year of hard things. She picked up her pen and went back to the accounts, because the accounts still needed keeping, and he went back to the harness he was mending, and they sat together in the lamplight until it was late enough to sleep, and neither of them said anything more about it, because some things don't need to be said more than once to be true. The consolidated file reached the commissioner's office in Cheyenne on the 14th of November, 1879. Prescott sent confirmation by the end of the month. The inquiry that followed would take most of the next year to resolve, moving through the slow machinery of territorial bureaucracy with the unhurried pace of institutions that are not personally inconvenienced by delay. But it moved. And in the meantime, the Hawthorne Ranch's boundaries held where they were recorded, and the east pasture kept its water, and the market garden's second-year beds were prepared with better drainage on the south end, turned and composted through the fall, so they'd be ready when the ground was right. And Hector Voss came in December to look at the well and said, as Gideon had promised, that he would have done the whole thing differently if he'd been there from the start. And then he fixed it properly, and it worked the way a well is supposed to work, and that mattered more than the commentary. Noah turned 8 in December. Gideon took him out on his first solo fence inspection, not solo exactly, Gideon rode alongside, but with Noah making the calls, where the breaks were, what they needed, what could wait and what couldn't. He came back looking like a person who had been given something real to do and had found that he was equal to it. He reported to Evelyn at dinner with the thoroughness of a field survey. 3 breaks, he said. 2 on the north section and 1 near the gate. The gate one is worse. Gideon says we should do that one first. What do you think? Evelyn said. He considered it. I think so too, he said. It's where the yearlings go when they're restless. Gideon, across the table, said nothing but watched Noah with the quiet, unguarded expression he had never quite managed to keep fully off his face when he was looking at the boy. May, who was 14 months old and had opinions about everything, slapped the table twice in a manner that suggested she wanted more cornbread and was done waiting for it to arrive on its own. May, Noah said with the authority of an older sibling. Manners. May looked at him. She slapped the table once more, thoughtfully, as if testing whether the principle held on a reduced application. Evelyn passed the cornbread. It was a Thursday evening in December, in the second year of a marriage that had started as a practical arrangement and had become something else entirely, on a ranch that had been failing and was no longer failing, in a valley where the fight was not finished but the ground was better than it had been, and all 4 of them were at the table, which was, when she let herself hold it plainly, without the habit of bracing against it, everything she had not known she was building toward when she stepped off a train in Dry Creek with $63 and a boy who held her hand and a secret she was afraid would end her before it began. She passed May another piece of cornbread and listened to Noah explain the fence situation further and watched Gideon listen to him with the full, unhurried attention he gave to things he cared about. And outside the December wind did what December wind does, and inside the lamp burned steady, and the Hawthorne Ranch held on. The commissioner's ruling came in March of 1881, and it was not a complete victory, which Evelyn had been careful not to promise anyone it would be. What it was, a formal finding that survey irregularities had occurred on 4 documented properties in the valley, that the alterations were inconsistent with natural displacement and showed evidence of deliberate interference, and that the original recorded boundaries on all 4 properties would be restored and restaked at the territory's expense. Harlan Cross was not named directly. The ruling was careful in exactly the way that rulings are careful when the subject has sufficient connections to make directness inconvenient. But the company Pruitt had represented was barred from filing acquisition claims in the county for a period of 3 years, pending a separate review of its operating practices. Prescott sent the ruling with a note that said, in his careful legal handwriting, "This is a better outcome than I initially expected. You built a persuasive file, Mrs. Hawthorne. Evelyn read the note twice and then put it in the account box with everything else. She told Gideon over breakfast, reading him the relevant sections. He listened without interrupting, which was his way, and when she finished, he was quiet for a moment and then said, 3 years. 3 years on the acquisition bar, she said, which doesn't stop him permanently. No. But it gives the properties time to consolidate their positions. If the other ranches use the time the way we've used the last 2 years, not everyone is you, Gideon said. Not critically, just exactly. They don't need to be me, she said. They just need to keep their documentation current and their titles clean. She set the letter down. I'm going to write to Frank and the others. They should hear it directly. He nodded. He was looking at her with the particular expression she had stopped trying to deflect, the one that said he was looking at something he valued and wasn't embarrassed about valuing. What? She said. Nothing. He pushed back from the table. I'll be in the south pasture. Gideon? He stopped at the door. Are you satisfied with how it came out? She said. The ruling. He thought about it with the deliberateness he brought to questions that deserved actual answers. I'm satisfied that the land is ours and it's recorded and nobody moved the marker back, he said. The rest of it, Cross and Pruitt and all of that, I've learned not to expect clean endings on those kinds of things. That's a reasonable position, she said. Is it enough for you? She considered it honestly. It's enough for now, she said, which is usually the best available answer. He held her gaze for a moment. Then he put his hat on and went out, and she listened to his boots cross the yard, and she poured herself more coffee and wrote to Frank Crow and the 2 other ranchers before the morning got away from her. By 1882, the Hawthorne Ranch had become, by the standards of that part of Wyoming, a working operation that nobody called struggling anymore. This had not happened quickly, and it had not happened without ongoing cost. There were still hard seasons, a cattle illness in the summer of 1881 that took 11 head before Gideon identified it and isolated the affected animals, a drought in the late summer that threatened the garden and required the well to work harder than it had been designed to. There were still months when the accounts balanced only because Evelyn moved money between columns with the skill of someone who understood that the appearance of solvency was itself a productive resource, buying time for the actual solvency to catch up. But the market garden was in its 3rd year and producing reliably. The arrangement with Clara's contact in Milford had expanded, 2 restaurants now, and a dry goods store that bought preserved goods through the fall season. Gideon had rebuilt the north pasture fencing properly, not in sections as money allowed, but all at once, using lumber from a mill in Milford that gave credit to established operations, which the Hawthorne Ranch now qualified as. The herd had grown from the depleted state it was in when Evelyn arrived to a size that generated consistent revenue rather than seasonal desperation. None of this was visible in a single moment. It accumulated the way most real things do, in small decisions made correctly more often than not, in bad luck absorbed and worked around, and 2 people who had learned each other's language well enough to operate without unnecessary friction most of the time. They still argued. Evelyn had stopped expecting that to change, and had come to understand it as a function of the fact that they both had strong opinions and neither of them was good at pretending otherwise. The arguments were different now than they'd been in the first year, less about territory, more about actual disagreement on actual questions. They were faster to resolve and less likely to leave residue. What had also changed, in a way that was harder to inventory, they had stopped being careful with each other in the early provisional way of people managing an arrangement. There was a different quality to the house now. Not ease exactly, because neither of them was built for ease, but something that had the density of the real thing, rather than the careful construction of something being assembled and tested. Noah was 9 and then 10 and then 11, and he grew the way children grow on working land, faster in some ways than his age suggested, with a competence that was practical and unsentimental, and slower in others, still carrying the wooden horse upstairs each night, with a loyalty that made Evelyn's chest ache in a way she couldn't describe precisely. He was Gideon's in every way that could be observed by anyone watching. They worked together with the easy fluency of people who have been doing something together long enough that the communication is mostly nonverbal. Gideon showed him things, how to read a horse's weight distribution, how to judge a fence post's depth by sound when you tapped it, how to look at the sky in the afternoon and know what it would be doing by evening. Noah absorbed all of it with the same focused attention he'd brought to everything since he was 4 years old at a table in a restaurant in Dry Creek, deciding whether Gideon was worth trusting. He was 14 when the question came up in a way neither of them had anticipated. It came from school, which Dry Creek had acquired by 1880. A single-room building with a teacher named Mr. Aldous, who had opinions about things he'd read and a variable grasp of the things he hadn't. Noah went 3 days a week when the ranch work allowed it, and came back with books and questions, and occasionally with the particular brittle look of a child who has had something said to him that he's still processing. He came home on a Thursday in the fall of 1882 with that look and went directly to the barn, which was what he did when he needed time before he was ready to talk. Evelyn gave him an hour. Then she went to the barn and found him working on a bridle he didn't need to be working on, doing it with the focused, unnecessary precision of someone whose hands needed to be occupied. "What happened?" she said. Not a question. He didn't look up. "Nothing." "Noah." A pause. His hands kept moving. "A boy at school said something." She waited. "He said..." Noah's voice had the controlled flatness of someone holding something down. "He said I wasn't really Gideon's son, because everyone knows." She stood very still. "Knows what? That I was... that you came here already. That Gideon isn't..." He stopped. He set the bridle down on the workbench and put both hands flat on the wood and looked at them. He was 14 with Gideon's same quality of going still rather than breaking when something hit him. "Is it true?" Evelyn looked at her son. He was not looking at her yet, but she could see his jaw, the set of it, the effort it was taking to keep his face from doing what it wanted to do. She had been waiting for this question in one form or another for years. She had thought about how to answer it, had rehearsed versions, had decided and undecided and decided again. And now it was here, and all the rehearsed versions felt inadequate in the way that prepared things always do when the real moment arrives. "Yes," she said. "Biologically, yes, it's true." He didn't move. "Gideon is not your biological father," she said. "You know that I came here to marry his brother Thomas, who died before I arrived. You know Gideon offered to marry me when there was no other reasonable option." She kept her voice even. "You have always known the circumstances of how we got here." "I knew the story," he said. I didn't think about what it meant." "What does it mean to you?" she said. "Right now, what does it mean?" He was quiet for a long moment. "I don't know," he said. His voice had cracked at the edges in the way that 14-year-old voices do, and she could hear in it the effort to manage what was happening to him. "Does it change how Gideon has been with you?" she said. "Does it change a single morning he's taken you out to the pasture, or a single thing he's taught you, or whether he listened when you talked to him?" He didn't answer immediately. She watched his hands on the workbench. "No," he said finally. "No," she agreed. "But..." He turned to look at her then, and his eyes were bright in the way that had nothing to do with weakness and everything to do with something being too large for its container. "Who is he?" The other one." She had known this was inside the larger question. She had been less certain about how to answer it. "He was not a good man," she said carefully. "He was not someone who was going to be part of our lives. That was my decision, and I've never questioned it." She looked at him directly. "That's as much as I'm going to tell you, because the rest of it isn't information that helps you. It's information that would just sit in you and weigh something." He looked at her for a long moment. She could see him deciding whether this was acceptable, which she respected. He had the right to decide. "Okay," he said, not happy with it, but accepting it. "The other thing," she said, is that Gideon doesn't know the full details either. He has never asked, and I have never told him more than the essential." She paused. "What he chose is what you've seen him choose every day since you were 4 years old." Noah was quiet. He picked up the bridle again, not working on it, just holding it. "The boy at school," he said. "He said it like it meant I wasn't real. Like what we are isn't real." "What we are is completely real," Evelyn said. "That boy has one definition of family, and it's a common one, and there are people who will carry it around like it means something important their whole lives." She looked at him. "It doesn't have to mean anything to you that it doesn't earn." He held the bridle. He was 14 and sitting in a barn, and his whole understanding of himself had just shifted slightly on its axis, and he was handling it with a steadiness she recognized because she'd worked hard to give it to him. "Should I tell Gideon?" he said. "What do you want to do?" He thought about it. "I think he should know the boy said it," he said. "Not because I don't need him to fix it. I just think he should know." "I think that's right," she said. He nodded. He set the bridle down again, this time definitively, and he stood up straight and looked like someone who had decided on the shape of something. "I'm going to go find him," he said. She watched him go out of the barn and across the yard toward the south pasture, and she sat down on the workbench stool and looked at the bridle he'd left, and she felt, running through the whole complexity of what had just happened, something that she could only call gratitude. Not tidy, not uncomplicated, but real. Aha. She didn't know what passed between Gideon and Noah in the south pasture that afternoon. She didn't ask, and neither of them reported it in full. What she knew was that Noah came in for dinner with the brittle look gone from his face, replaced by something that had been processed and set down. And Gideon came in behind him with his hands freshly washed and a quietness about him that she recognized as the aftermath of something that mattered. At dinner, May, who was 4 now and had all the tact of a small artillery piece, said to Noah, "Why is your face different?" "It's not different," Noah said. "It was different before dinner. Now it's normal." "That's a strange thing to notice," he said. "I notice everything," May said with great confidence. This was unfortunately accurate. Gideon looked at Evelyn across the table. She looked back at him. They did not need to say anything. After dinner, when the children were occupied, Noah reading in the loft, May conducting some kind of organizational project with stones she'd been collecting, Gideon came to stand beside Evelyn at the wash basin and said quietly, "He's all right." "I know," she said. He paused. "He asked me something." She looked at him. "He asked me if it changed anything," Gideon said. "Me knowing, the full picture." "What did you tell him?" Gideon was quiet for a moment. "I told him that the first day I saw him on that platform holding your hand, I thought, that's a kid who's been paying attention to the world because he's had to, and that costs something, and it should be worth something." He was looking at the basin. "I told him I've been sure about very few things in my life. He's one of them." Evelyn looked at her husband. He was not comfortable saying these things. She could see the slight stiffness of it, the effort it cost him to pull them out and say them plainly, and that made them worth more, not less. "Gideon," she said. "Yeah. Thank you," she said, "for what you said to him, and for all of it. Before that, too." He glanced at her sideways. "You don't need to thank me for what—" "I know I don't need to," she said. "I want to." He was quiet for a moment, looking at his hands drying on the cloth. Then he said, "I should be thanking you." "For what?" "For not leaving," he said. "That first week, when the house was a wreck and the accounts were a disaster, and I wasn't easy to know." He paused. "You could have found a way back." "I didn't want a way back," she said. He looked at her then, directly, without the slight angle he sometimes used when something felt too exposed. "When did that change?" he said. "From managing the situation to not wanting a way back." She thought about it honestly. "I'm not sure it was a single moment," she said. "I think it accumulated." She looked at him. "Somewhere around the time you sat still for 40 minutes so May could sleep on your shoulder, I think the calculation changed." He looked like he might say something, and then he didn't. He folded the drying cloth and set it on the basin ledge with the careful precision he brought to small tasks, and then he turned and went back to the main room, and she stood at the basin for a moment longer before following. May grew up loud, specific, and entirely herself. Where Noah had always been careful, with his words, his movements, his affection, offering them when he'd decided they were warranted, May was constitutionally incapable of that kind of measurement. She said what she thought at the volume she felt, and she loved the people she loved with the uncomplicated directness of someone who had never been given a reason to believe love needed managing. She was, in the parlance of Dry Creek, a handful. This was said by people who found her exhausting, and it was also said by people who adored her. And the distinction between those groups was not always clear. At 5, she told Helen Beatty at the dry goods store that her hat was the wrong color for her face. Helen Beatty, who was not accustomed to being addressed this way by people under 5 feet tall, reported this to 3 people, all of whom privately agreed with May, but none of whom said so. At 7, she organized a system for collecting and sorting the rocks in the creek bed by composition. A system she explained to Gideon in technical detail he did not fully follow, but listened to with complete attention anyway. At 8, she decided she was going to learn to ride properly. And she meant properly, not the supervised slow circles that Noah had started with. She told Gideon this at breakfast, with the manner of someone announcing a plan that had already been decided rather than requesting permission for one. "No," Gideon said. "Why not?" "Because you're 8 and Clarence is 17 hands. Clarence likes me. Clarence tolerates you. We've had this conversation." "I've been riding with you for 2 years," May said. "I know what I'm doing." "You know how to sit on a horse while I control it," Gideon said. "That's not the same thing." "Then teach me the same thing." Gideon looked at Evelyn. Evelyn poured coffee and said nothing, because this was genuinely between them and she had learned not to mediate May's negotiations. It didn't serve anyone. "I'll teach you on Pepper," Gideon said. Pepper was the small mare he'd bought the previous spring. 14 hands, steady. "We start on the ground. I say when you're ready to progress. You don't argue with my assessment." May considered this. What if your assessment is wrong? It won't be. But if it is, eat it. May. She looked at him with the evaluating expression she'd been deploying since she could focus her eyes. "Okay," she said, and went back to her breakfast. Noah, across the table, caught Gideon's eye and said nothing, but the quality of his nothing said, "Good luck." May learned to ride Pepper with the focus of someone who has decided this is simply the next thing she is going to master, and she progressed faster than Gideon said she would, which she did not mention out loud, but which was visible in the way she carried herself when she came in from the paddock. She was not reckless. She was precise, which was different. She learned the way she'd watched Noah learn things, by understanding not just the action, but the reason for it. "She's going to be something," Gideon said to Evelyn one evening, watching May in the paddock from the yard. "She already is something," Evelyn said. "I mean, she's going to want a lot of room." "She comes by that honestly," Evelyn said. He glanced at her. "From which side?" "Both," she said. He made the sound that was almost a laugh. The spring of 1883 brought the Hawthorns a second son, which nobody had been expecting, including Evelyn, and which arrived with somewhat less drama than May, but with its own complications. A difficult 3rd trimester, a labor that went long, a boy who came into the world quiet in a way that frightened everyone for a minute before he decided to participate fully. They named him James, Gideon's father's name. Evelyn made the suggestion, and Gideon had gone very still the way he did when something landed in a place he hadn't been protecting well enough. And then he said yes, without a lot of additional words, which was fine. James was a different child from the first day. Easy in his body, given to long, serious observation of whatever was directly in front of him, patient in a way that bore no resemblance to either of his parents. Noah was 17 by then and regarded the baby with the protective attention of someone who understands what it is to arrive in a family and need it to hold. "He looks like you," Noah told Gideon one evening when Gideon was holding James by the lamp. "You think so?" Gideon looked at the baby skeptically. "Around the forehead," Noah said. May leaned over to look. "The nose, too," she said. James, for his part, regarded all of them with the equanimity of someone who has just arrived and is still forming opinions. Gideon looked at Noah, and then at May, and then at the baby in his arms, and Evelyn watched his face from across the room and saw in it something she had never quite been able to describe. The look of a man who had walked into a particular kind of abundance without a plan for it, and who was still slightly astonished that it had held. The valley continued to change through the early 1880s, as valleys do when the railroad gets closer and the territory starts looking more like a state and less like a frontier. More settlers came. The town of Dry Creek added a 2nd Street and a doctor's office and a school that ran 5 days instead of 3. Land values rose. The Hawthorne Ranch's value rose with them. This was not something Evelyn had planned for. She had planned for survival, and then for stability, and then, cautiously, for growth. But appreciation as an abstract concept had been too far out to calculate when they were moving cattle feed to cover the winter and arguing about whether to buy from Carlisle or Milford. She noticed it in the offers that came, unsolicited, in 1882 and again in 1883. Legitimate offers from legitimate buyers, not cross-style pressure, but straightforward interest in land that had demonstrated value. She filed them in the account box. "You're keeping them," Gideon said, the second time. "I keep everything," she said. "We're not selling." "No," she agreed, "but understanding what we're worth is useful. It tells you what position you're negotiating from." She looked at him. "On anything." He accepted this logic. He usually did when it was a sufficiently concrete form. What the rising value also meant was that the Harlan Cross situation, which had been quiet since the commissioner's ruling, was attracting different kinds of attention. Cross himself had apparently redirected his operations to a different county, which Prescott confirmed in a letter in mid-1882. The bar on his company's acquisition filings had expired, but the documented pattern of behavior now existed in a territorial record that any future action would have to account for. It was not a resolution, it was a deterrent, which was the best available version. Frank Crow, who had become a genuine if unlikely neighbor, the kind you didn't choose but found yourself relying on, told Gideon at the feed store that the Kimball place had sold to a young couple from Ohio who were putting in wheat. "New blood," Frank said. "Not like the old days." "Is that good or bad?" Noah asked when Gideon reported this at dinner. "Neither," Gideon said. "It's just different." "The land stays," Noah said. He was 17 and had been thinking about things in terms of permanence and impermanence more lately, in the way that teenagers do when they start to sense that the world they grew up in has an edge somewhere. "The land stays," Gideon confirmed. Noah looked at the table. "I want to work this ranch," he said. "When I'm grown. I don't want to be somewhere else doing something else." Gideon looked at him. "We'll talk about that when it's time. I know, I just wanted to say it." Noah looked up. "I wanted you to know." The table was quiet for a moment. May was eating with the focused efficiency she brought to all tasks. James was asleep in his cradle near the stove. "I know," Gideon said. And that was all he said, but it was the right amount. The summer that Noah turned 17, Gideon started teaching him the business side of the ranch in full. Not the operational side, which Noah already knew as well as Gideon did, but the accounts, the pricing decisions, the relationships with buyers and suppliers, the legal documents that Evelyn kept filed and current. He brought Noah to Evelyn first. "You should teach him this part," he told her. "I can show him the land. You know the rest better." Noah looked from one to the other. "Sit down," Evelyn said. She taught him the way she'd taught herself, without romanticizing it, without pretending the numbers were anything other than what they were, without simplifying the hard parts. She went through every file in the account box over 3 weeks of evenings, explaining what each document meant and why it existed and what would happen if it didn't. Noah listened with the same focused attention he'd always brought to information that mattered. "You kept all of this from the beginning?" he said, looking at the stack. "From before the beginning," she said. "I made notes about what Pruitt said before we even had anything to file." He turned the papers in his hands. "Because you knew." "I suspected," she said. "Knowing comes after." He was quiet for a moment. "Who taught you this?" he said. "All of it. The accounts, the legal. Who taught you to think this way?" She considered the question. "Necessity," she said. "Mostly." She paused. "And paying attention to what was actually happening rather than what I wished was happening." He turned the papers over in his hands. "When you got off the train," he said slowly, "did you think it was going to work? Any of it?" She looked at her son, 17, broad-shouldered now, with Gideon's same quality of stillness and something that was entirely his own. And she thought about the woman who had stood on that platform with $63 and a 4-year-old and a secret she was terrified of and a dead man's name on a letter in her bag. "No," she said honestly. "I didn't let myself think that far. I thought about the next thing, and then the thing after that." "And now?" he said. She looked around the kitchen. The stove that worked properly now, the window that didn't draft, the account box full of filed and current documents, the cradle near the wall where James slept with the easy confidence of a child who has never known anything other than being held. Now, she said, I think about further out. She looked at him. Now I think it holds. He looked at her for a long moment. He had his own opinion of her. She had known that for a long time, had seen it in the way he spoke about her to other people, the quiet pride of it. And she saw it now, in the afternoon light of a kitchen in a ranch that had gone from failing to standing to something that could be called, without exaggeration, good. Okay, he said, and went back to the papers. Gideon came in from the south pasture at dusk, the same way he had come in from the south pasture at dusk for 5 years now, and he washed up at the pump and came through the door. And May looked up from her stones to report that James had been awake and was now asleep again, and she had managed it herself, which she felt should be noted. Gideon said it was noted. Noah looked up from the account papers, and they exchanged the look they exchanged across rooms now. Easy, unguarded, the look of people who have been in each other's company long enough that it requires no explanation. Evelyn put dinner on the table. Outside, the summer evening was long and warm in the particular way of Wyoming summers, when the days stretch almost past endurance and the light goes reluctant and golden before it finally gives up. The valley sat in it, the Hawthorne Ranch and Frank Crow's fence line visible to the east and the mountain range still blue and enormous in the distance. And inside the kitchen, the 5 of them arranged themselves around the table with the practiced ease of people who know exactly where their place is. Not because it was assigned, because it had been built day by day out of hard choices made consistently in the same direction. And it had held, and it was theirs. May said, I think James is going to talk soon. He looked at me today like he had something to say. He looked at you like he wanted you to stop making noise, Noah said. That's not true. He's interested in me. Everyone is interested in you, Noah said. It's impossible not to be. You're very loud. May considered this. Thank you, she said, without irony. Gideon looked at Evelyn. Evelyn looked at Gideon. Across 5 years and 2 children and a drought and a land dispute and a winter that had tried to end them and 100 smaller things that hadn't made it into the stories they told, they looked at each other with the full, unhurried recognition of people who have chosen the same thing every day and do not regret it. Then May said something else, and Noah argued with her, and James woke up and had opinions about it, and dinner went on the way it always did, which was to say it was imperfect and loud and entirely completely real. James learned to talk at 14 months, which May considered a personal achievement since she had spent most of those 14 months narrating the world to him in considerable detail. By the time he was 2, he was forming sentences. By 3, he was asking questions that stopped adults mid-task. Not because they were unanswerable, but because they were the kind of questions that required actual thought rather than reflex. Why does the creek run that direction and not the other? If the fence keeps the cattle in, what keeps everything else out? Why do people in town look at us different than they look at each other? That last one came on a Saturday in the fall of 1885. Driving back from Dry Creek in the wagon, James wedged between Evelyn and Gideon with the self-satisfied posture of someone who has secured the best seat. May was in the wagon bed with a book she was reading with one hand and holding her hat down with the other against the wind. Noah had stayed back at the ranch. Different how? Evelyn said. James thought about it. Like we're bigger than them, he said. Even when we're not. Gideon looked over James's head at Evelyn. She looked back at him. Some people look at what you've built, Evelyn said carefully, and it reminds them of what they haven't. James chewed on this for a while. Is that our fault? No, Gideon said. Should we make ourselves smaller so they feel better? No, Gideon said, more firmly. Good, James said, with the serene conviction of a 3-year-old who has arrived at a position he finds satisfying, and looked back at the road. May lowered her book just enough to make eye contact with Evelyn over James's head. Her expression said, He's going to be a lot. Evelyn's expression said, I know. May went back to her book. Noah was 20 when he told Gideon he wanted to talk about the ranch's future. He said it on a Sunday morning in the spring of 1886. With a directness that was recognizably his, no preamble, no softening, sitting across from Gideon at the table while Evelyn was in the garden, and May was somewhere with James, and the quiet of the house had the particular Sunday quality of space to say things. The future how? Gideon said. Long term, Noah said. What you're planning, what happens to the property. I want to understand where I fit into that. Gideon looked at him. Noah had his mother's quality of saying hard things without dressing them up, and he had developed, over the years, a version of Gideon's own stillness, not inherited, but absorbed, the way people absorb the qualities they spend enough time around. I haven't put it to paper yet, Gideon said. I know. I'm asking what you're thinking before it goes to paper. He held Gideon's gaze. Because I want to tell you what I'm thinking too, and I'd rather do it before anything is decided. Gideon leaned back in his chair. All right, tell me. I want to stay, Noah said. I've wanted that since I was 17, and I told you then, and I'm still telling you now. I want to work this land. I want to manage it eventually. He paused. I want to build on what's already here, not start over somewhere else. Nobody's asked you to start over somewhere else. Not yet, Noah said. But when the ranch passes, however it passes, I want to know that this is a real option. Not just because I've been here and worked it, but because you've decided it's where I belong. Gideon was quiet for a long moment. Outside, the spring morning was doing what spring mornings did. The light still thin, the air carrying the last resistance of winter before the season made its final decision. There's something I need to tell you first, Gideon said. Noah waited. I should have said it before now, Gideon said. I've thought about how to say it for years, and I kept waiting for... I don't know what I was waiting for. The right time, which doesn't exist, so... What is it? Gideon looked at his hands on the table. Then he looked at Noah. When your mother and I married, I knew what the situation was. She told me about the man who... Your father. Your biological father. She told me he was not going to be part of your lives. He paused. What she didn't tell me, and what I eventually came to understand on my own, was the full extent of why. I won't go into it. It's not mine to tell. He held Noah's gaze. What I want you to know is that I have been aware, for most of your life, that you came to me out of a situation that wasn't fair to you before it even started, and that every single day since that first day, I have chosen to be your father without reservation or condition. Noah was very still. Not because you needed me to, Gideon said. You were doing fine. You had your mother, and you were paying attention to everything, and you would have been all right. He paused. I chose it because you were worth choosing. Because I looked at that 4-year-old on a train platform who was holding his mother's hand and watching the world with those serious eyes, and I thought, whoever shows up for this kid is getting something, and I wanted it to be me. The room was quiet. I don't know if that's the thing a father is supposed to say, Gideon said. I don't have much to compare it to. My own father was decent, but not the talking kind. He stopped. I just wanted to say it. Before we talk about the ranch, before any of that, I wanted to make sure you knew. Noah looked at him for a long time. His jaw worked once and then stopped. He was 20 years old, and he had Gideon's same habit of going entirely still when something hit deep enough that motion felt inadequate. Then he reached across the table and put his hand on Gideon's arm. Not a handshake, not a formal gesture, just his hand on his father's arm, staying there. I know, he said. His voice was not entirely steady. I've known for a long time. Gideon put his other hand over Noah's. They sat like that for a moment, 2 men at a kitchen table on a Sunday morning, and neither of them said anything more about it because it had been said. Then Gideon cleared his throat. Now, he said, tell me what you're thinking about the North Pasture expansion. Noah took his hand back and straightened in his chair, and a slow, genuine smile crossed his face, the kind that doesn't come from politeness. I think we should push the fence line another 1/4 mile northeast, he said. The grass up there is better than what we're using. And the water? Creek bends north up there. I've walked it. Gideon nodded slowly. Show me on the plat map. Noah got up and got the map from the account box. He knew where everything was now, had known for 3 years. And they spread it on the table and bent over it together, and the morning opened up around them. And outside Evelyn was in the garden, and May was teaching James something that involved a stick, and a considerable amount of instruction, and the Hawthorne Ranch sat in the spring light doing what it had been doing for years now. Holding. Evelyn came in from the garden an hour later to find them still at the table with the map, arguing about the northeast boundary with the comfortable specificity of people who disagree about something they both care about. She looked at them for a moment from the doorway. She had the experience, sometimes, of seeing her life from a slight distance, as if she had stepped briefly outside it and could observe it the way you observe a thing you've made, checking its proportions against what you intended. She had not intended any of this specifically. She had intended to survive, and then to stabilize, and then, somewhere along the way, without marking the exact point, she had stopped intending and started inhabiting. This kitchen, this man, these children. This particular argument about a fence line on a Sunday morning while the spring light came through the window and the coffee on the stove was still hot. She had not planned any of it. She had just done the next thing, and then the thing after that, and it had accumulated into something she didn't have a word large enough for. Not happiness exactly. Happiness was too simple, too static. Something more like rightness, like a structure that had been tested from several directions and was still standing, and you knew it was standing, not because nothing had hit it, but because everything had, and it held. She poured herself coffee and sat down at the end of the table and said, "The northeast boundary." Both of them looked at her. "The drainage runs west along the ridge," she said. "If you push the fence northeast and have a wet fall, you'll have standing water in the low sections before November." She turned the map to look at it properly. "But if you run the fence southeast from the ridge instead of northeast, you get the same grass coverage, and the drainage works for you instead of against you." Noah looked at the map. "That's not the line I walked." "Walk it again from the ridge down," she said. "You'll see it." He studied the map for a moment. "She's right," he said to Gideon. "I know," Gideon said. He was looking at Evelyn with the expression she had long since stopped trying to deflect. "She usually is." "I'm not usually right," Evelyn said. "I'm right about drainage." "And accounts," Noah said. "And people," Gideon said. She looked at her coffee cup. "Don't overstate it," she said. "I was badly wrong about Thomas." The table was quiet for a moment. Not uncomfortable, just the natural weight of a true thing being acknowledged. "You weren't wrong about Thomas," Gideon said more carefully. "You didn't know Thomas. You knew the letters. Those are different things." She looked at him. "Is that a meaningful distinction?" "I think so," he said. "You made the best decision available with the information you had. That's all anyone can do." She held his gaze. After all these years, he still sometimes said the exact right thing without appearing to try, and it still occasionally surprised her. "Besides," Noah said, practical as always, "if Thomas hadn't died, you wouldn't have married Gideon. And then none of this—" He gestured at the kitchen, the window, the map on the table, the sound of May's voice in the yard. "None of this would be what it is." "That's a complicated thing to be grateful for," Evelyn said. "Most true things are complicated," Noah said. She looked at her son, 20 years old, sitting at a table with his father, arguing about land they both intended to work for the rest of their lives. And she thought that he had, somewhere between 4 and 20, become exactly himself. Not a version of her, not a version of Gideon, not a sum of circumstances. Himself, with all of it inside him, the hard beginning and the daily choosing and the years of being held by people who meant it, become something particular and durable and his. That was the thing she had not known to hope for. In the beginning, she had hoped for survival. She had hoped for stability. She had not known to hope for this. Children who became themselves, fully, in the space you made for them. May married at 22, which was later than the Valley expected and earlier than Evelyn would have preferred, to a man named Robert Calloway, who was a surveyor with the Territorial Land Office and who had, by the time he presented himself to Gideon, demonstrated a thorough understanding that May Hawthorne required a particular kind of man, specifically one who was not easily overwhelmed. Gideon had looked him over with the careful assessment he brought to things he valued and did not want to make a mistake about, and then he had said, "If she chooses you, that's the only endorsement that matters." Robert Calloway, who was a smart man, said, "I know that, sir." Gideon nodded. "Then we understand each other." They did understand each other, as it turned out. May and Robert settled on a property 3 miles from the Hawthorne Ranch, close enough to be present, far enough to be separate, a balance May had clearly calculated in advance. She came back to the Hawthorne kitchen with the comfortable frequency of someone who has left by choice rather than circumstance, bringing opinions and cornbread and eventually, a daughter named Clara, who had May's same quality of observing everything and a patience for it that appeared to come from Robert's side. James grew into someone that nobody had predicted, which was perhaps the truest thing that could be said about him. He was quieter than May and less solitary than Noah had been, occupying a middle quality that was entirely his own, interested in everything, committed to most things, easily the most sociable of the three. He went to school in Dry Creek with full attendance, and then at 17 announced that he wanted to study law in Cheyenne. The table was quiet when he said it. Law, Gideon said. Land law, James said. Specifically, territorial property rights. He looked at his parents. You spent years fighting to keep this ranch. You had Prescott, who was good, but you were also doing half the work yourselves because Prescott wasn't always available and the situation required someone who understood the legal side and could act on it. He held their gaze. There are 50 ranches in this valley with the same vulnerabilities you had. They don't have a mother who can build a case file and a Prescott who knows where the records are. Evelyn and Gideon looked at each other. You've been thinking about this for a while, Evelyn said. Since I was about 8 and you explained the cross situation to me, James said. I've been looking at it from different angles. Gideon looked at his youngest son, 17 and already 3 moves ahead, and he said, What do you need? They found a way to send him. It required the ranch operating on a tighter budget for 2 years, which it had done before and survived. James went to Cheyenne and studied with a thoroughness that his letters reported in detail, because he had always been constitutionally incapable of doing anything at less than full attention. He came back at 22 with a law certificate and a working knowledge of territorial property rights that was, as he had assessed, directly applicable to half the ranches in the valley. He opened a practice in Dry Creek, which by 1890 had grown enough to support one, and his first clients were Frank Crow and 2 other ranchers whose title situations had been quietly uncertain for years. He charged what they could pay, which varied, and he kept meticulous records, which ran in the family. Evelyn went to his office on the day he opened it. She sat across from him at the desk he'd bought secondhand and had cleaned and leveled himself, and she looked at her youngest child, this boy who had sat between her and Gideon in a wagon at 3 years old and asked why people in town looked at them different. This boy who had watched her build case files at the kitchen table and decided that was a thing worth doing at scale, and she felt the full, unmanageable quality of it. You should know, she said, that this is because of you. He looked at her. Not me, she said. You decided this. You walked yourself from that question to this answer over 17 years. I just kept the files where you could see them. You did more than that, he said. Not as much as you think, she said. Children decide who they become. Parents just provide the material. He looked at her for a moment with the particular quality he had of looking at things he was thinking seriously about. Is that what you believe? He said. Really? She thought about it honestly. I believe you come with a shape, she said, and what happens to you either works with that shape or against it. We tried to work with it, all of you. Your shape was toward this. She gestured at the office, the desk, the stack of new files waiting. We just made sure nothing crushed it before you got here. He was quiet for a moment. Mom, he said. Yes. That's not a small thing, he said, making sure nothing crushes it. She looked at her hands in her lap. No, she said. It's not. Gideon's health began to show its age in the early 1890s, which was not dramatic and not sudden, but was the cumulative physical accounting of 20 years of hard land and hard seasons. His back had always been a problem, a fall from a horse in 1880 that he had handled with his characteristic brevity about his own suffering. And it worsened through the winters with the patient persistence of injuries that were never properly rested. He slowed in the way that working men slow, not stopping, never stopping, but operating with slightly less range than before, making adjustments without announcing them. Evelyn watched this and said what she could and accepted what she couldn't change, which was the negotiation you made with time when you were living inside it. Noah took over the primary management of the ranch in 1891, which was not a handover. Gideon did not do handovers, but a gradual shift in who was making the daily calls, so gradual that there was no single morning when it tipped from one to the other. Noah ran the ranch with a thoroughness that acknowledged everything Gideon had taught him and added his own reading of the land and the market and the valley's changing needs. He was 25 and unmarried and entirely absorbed in the property, which occasionally worried Evelyn, and which she managed by saying nothing about it, because Noah made his decisions the same way everyone in this family made decisions, in his own time, after he'd considered everything he needed to consider. He married at 27, a woman named Ruth Aldis, the schoolteacher's daughter, as it happened, who had grown up in Dry Creek and had the quality of clear, direct intelligence that Noah appeared to find necessary in a person before he could spend significant time with them. They settled in the Hawthorne house, which was the intention, Gideon and Evelyn moving to the smaller structure that had been added to the property in 1884. 2 rooms and a good stove and a porch that faced the mountain range. Evelyn had expected to find this transition difficult and was surprised to discover she didn't. The house had been a tool, ultimately, a container for the work and the people. The work continued. The people were still close enough to walk to. The porch faced west, and the mountain range in the evening light was a thing you could look at for a long time without needing anything else from it. Gideon sat with her on that porch on a warm evening in the September of 1893, 15 years after she had stepped off a train in Dry Creek, with a 4-year-old and $63 and a determination she had not yet fully understood as such. And they sat in the kind of quiet that requires no management. Noah was in the main house with Ruth and their daughter, who was 2 and had Noah's serious eyes and her mother's complete lack of interest in being told what to do. May and Robert were 3 miles east. James's office light was visible from the road into town on late evenings when he was working, which was most evenings. The valley had changed. More houses, more fences, more of the infrastructure of permanence, and the Hawthorne Ranch sat inside all of it, established, documented, held. "I've been thinking about Thomas," Gideon said, out of nowhere and not out of nowhere. Evelyn looked at him. Not sad," he said, "just thinking." He was looking at the mountains. He would have been good with Noah, I think. He was the dreaming kind, like I said. Noah would have liked that when he was small. The stories of it. He might have, Evelyn agreed. But he wouldn't have known what to do when the accounts didn't work, Gideon said, or when Pruitt showed up, or with any of the... He was good at the vision of things, not the grinding through. "You don't know that," Evelyn said. "People are different when the real thing comes." "Maybe." He paused. "I used to feel guilty about it, that I had what should have been his. And now?" He was quiet for a moment. "Now I think life makes its deals, and you work with what you're given," he said. "Thomas made the ranch possible, and he made it so you could be here. And then it went the way it went, and what we made of it was ours to make." He glanced at her. "I stopped feeling guilty about it when I understood that. It took a while." She looked at the mountains. The light was going gold and long across the valley, the way it did in September when the season was beginning its turn. She thought about a train platform in the blistering summer of 1878, and a stranger with honest gray eyes who turned his hat in his hands and offered her something she had no reason to trust. She thought about what it is to trust a thing anyway. Not blindly, she had never done anything blindly in her life, but deliberately, with an accurate accounting of the risk and a decision that the risk was worth what was on the other side of it. That was not hope, exactly. It was something more structural than hope. It was a choice, made with open eyes, made again the next day and the day after. "Gideon," she said. "Yeah, do you know what I think about?" She didn't wait for him to answer. "I think about that first dinner at Claire's restaurant. You asked if I'd eaten." She paused. "Before anything else. Before you said a word about the ranch or the arrangement or any of it. You asked if I'd eaten." He looked at her. "I remember." "That was when I decided," she said. "I didn't know it then, but that was it." He was quiet for a moment. "That's not very much to decide on," he said. "It's enough," she said. "It told me the kind of attention you paid to things." She looked at him. "The kind of attention you paid turned out to be the kind I could build something with." He held her gaze with the full, unguarded quality he had developed over years of this, of being with a person long enough that the self-protection became unnecessary, not because nothing could hurt you, but because you trusted the other person with the parts that could. "Evelyn," he said. "Yes. I'm glad you didn't take the train back," he said. She smiled, A real one, the kind that didn't perform anything. "So am I," she said. They sat on the porch while the light went, and the mountains went from gold to gray to blue in the evening sequence they always followed. And across the yard, the main house was lit and warm, and Noah's voice was audible for a moment through the open window. And then his daughter's, and then Ruth's, and the sounds mixed with the evening birds and the wind through the grass, and made a texture of sound that was, if you were paying the kind of attention Evelyn always paid, indistinguishable from the sound of a life that had been fully inhabited. This is what she had learned across all of it. The accounting is not the point. You don't arrive somewhere and count up what it cost and what it returned and call it settled. You just keep choosing and keep showing up and keep doing the next thing. And if you're fortunate and also stubborn and also willing to let people be complicated rather than simple, if you're willing to do that, then the thing you build is not what you planned for. It is something better and harder and entirely yours. And you do not hold it lightly, and you do not stop being grateful for it. And you understand finally that it was always the choosing that mattered and not the arriving. She had chosen and been chosen. The rest was everything. Noah found the account box after Evelyn died in the winter of 1907. Going through the house with the methodical attention she had taught him was the appropriate response to hard things that needed doing. He knew the box. He had been taught its contents at 17, had added to it himself in the years since. But he went through it again anyway, paper by paper, in the lamp-lit quiet of a January evening with Gideon asleep in the chair by the stove and Ruth sitting across the room and the grandchildren in the loft above. He found the notes she had made on the day Pruitt visited. February 1879. His mother's handwriting, neat and unhurried, setting down everything the man said and the order he said it, and the name on his card and her own assessment, likely not the last contact. Maintain documentation. She had not been afraid, she had just been paying attention. He found the first letter from Prescott, which she had kept although there was no legal reason to. He found the note from the commissioner's office and Prescott's confirming letter, and beneath that, in an envelope he had not seen before, a letter in his mother's handwriting addressed to no one. He looked at it for a long time before he opened it. It was dated 1889, the year he had turned 23. It was not a letter exactly, more a set of things she had wanted to say somewhere, whether or not anyone read them. He read it. She had written, "The thing I know now that I did not know at the start is that belonging is not a thing you find. It is a thing you build, with specific materials and specific people, on ground you have decided to stay on long enough to know it. You cannot rush it, and you cannot fake it, and you cannot arrive at it by wanting. You can only make the choices, day by day, that keep the thing possible, and then one morning you look up and it is not possible anymore. It is actual. And you understand that the distance between possible and actual is just time, and time is just showing up." He read it twice. He folded it and put it back in the envelope and put the envelope in the account box, which he was keeping, which the ranch was keeping, which would be here when his own daughter was old enough to go through it and would need to understand where she came from. Gideon woke in the chair and looked at him. "She wrote things down," Noah said. He wasn't sure why he said it. "She always did," Gideon said. "I found a letter." Gideon looked at the envelope. He didn't ask what it said. He knew his wife. "She was right," Noah said, "about everything in it." Gideon was quiet for a moment. He was 80 years old and his back gave him trouble every morning, and he had been the kind of tired for 3 weeks that doesn't resolve with sleep. And he looked at his son across the lamp-lit room with the same quality he had always brought to looking at him. Complete, unguarded, the look of a man who knows exactly what he values and has no remaining interest in concealing it. "She usually was," Gideon said. Noah put the letter back in the box. He closed the lid. He set it on the shelf where it had always been. In the kitchen of a ranch that had gone from failing to standing to something that could be called, without exaggeration or sentiment, a legacy. Not because the land was grand or the name was known, but because the people had chosen each other, repeatedly, across hard seasons, and the choosing had held. Outside, the January night was cold and clear and enormous, the way Wyoming nights are in winter, the sky showing more stars than seemed possible over so much ordinary ground. Inside, the lamp burned and the house was warm, and Ruth put her hand briefly on Noah's shoulder as she passed, and upstairs the grandchildren slept, and the account box sat on the shelf with everything in it, all of it kept, all of it held. The Hawthorne Ranch stood in the dark and the cold and the starlight, and it did not need anyone to be looking at it to be real. It was real because of what had been poured into it, because of a woman who arrived with nothing but paid attention, because of a man who asked if she'd eaten before he asked anything else, because of a boy who held his mother's hand on a train platform and watched the world with serious eyes and decided, eventually, that the man who showed up for him was the one who counted, because of a girl who was loud and specific and took up the space she needed without apology, because of all of it, accumulated, held in the ground and the walls and the account box on the shelf. That is how legacies work, in the end. Not in the grand gestures, in the daily ones, in the choosing and the staying and the doing of the next thing and the next. The light held, the house held, and the story, which had never needed to be anything other than what it was complete.